So most of us are here for the entire week. A few people are here just for the weekend, and the binder is of the material just for this weekend. There's going to be a lot more handouts coming for the 5 days that follow. So I want to just point out some of the basic structure of the handout. The first thing you'll notice if you turn past the title page is a little diagram that shows you 6 circles around a central circle. This is one of the fundamental diagrams of sacred geometry, that you can perfectly nest 6 equally sized circles around a central circle. It's the fundamental harmonic of 7, like the 7 days of creation. And you'll be exploring this with Jane later on. And in putting together the course this time, we haven't done this course since the summer of 2004. And so last time we did it, we taped the initial weekend, and that's what some of you have seen as the DVD set of sacred geometry we have available. It's the opening weekend from 2004. Some of the material from that we're also going to be doing this weekend. Some of the material is new. And I've restructured the opening weekend from how we did it last time according to this particular diagram. Because what I realized after doing the course in 2004 is that the term sacred geometry is being used today in a variety of different contexts. And so depending on what book you read or person you talk to or class you attend, you could have sacred geometry discussed in very different ways. And so this is a collection of some of the different contexts that sacred geometry is discussed today. So in the center, you see the central circle that everything else comes out of, thought forms in the mind of God. And then with the 6-pointed star of the 6 circles around it, we have the pattern language and pattern recognition, which is related to the divine alphabet of creation. Every letter in sacred geometry is the shapes that create everything in our world. So that just as we learn as school children to speak an earthly language by learning one letter at a time, and then putting those letters together to form words that have meaning, so when we understand nature's language, we learn one shape at a time, and we see the way that that shape is used for a function in nature, and that multiple shapes or functions are brought together for all natural activities. So we begin with sacred geometry to be able to recognize hidden patterns behind things and find hidden relationships between things that we thought to begin with had no connection between them. We find that they are actually very closely connected in some cases because of the hidden patterns that are revealed. And so this idea of the alphabet of creation is very important. Next, spiritual initiation, masters of the net. One of the major aspects of sacred geometry that makes it sacred is the spiritual initiation aspect. And there is a lineage, particularly in the West, that was known as the masters of the net, of people being initiated into the mysteries of sacred geometry. And in fact, for what we're going to be covering today on Saturday in my lecture and slideshow is going to be primarily connected to these first 3 pieces: thought forms in the mind of God, pattern recognition, and spiritual initiation of the masters of the net. Then the next 4 topics are going to be covered tomorrow on Sunday. The union of spirit and science. Sacred geometry is remarkable because the same patterns that were taught in the ancient spiritual schools have now been rediscovered in modern science and technology. And so what we really have today in modern science is a rediscovery of the old temple science knowledge, but without the holistic context that the temple science operated in. So we're going to be going over a bit of these concepts about how, through sacred geometry, we can have a healthy merger of spiritual and scientific knowledge, because there are patterns common to both. Next is the hidden energy science. I sometimes call this the temple science, because when you get down to the application of sacred geometry, every form in sacred geometry, as I mentioned, has a function. It has an energy quality to it. And so there is a long tradition that has primarily been hidden for most of human history of how these patterns can be applied for specific energetic effects. Next is holistic health and healing, because one of the ways that we're going to apply these energies and these forms is for health and healing, and this has been done for thousands of years. And finally, sacred design, the masters of the compass. One of the primary fields that is brought forward to the public very often with sacred geometry is sacred architecture. And so again, you will find some courses, some books that deal with sacred geometry only in terms of design and architecture. So we'll be looking at that tomorrow as well. If you then turn to the table of contents, then we've broken down the handouts here for the weekend according to these different topics: thought forms the mind of God, the pattern language, etc. And some of the handouts here relate to things I'm going to be discussing in the slideshow and lecture, and some of them we're not going to be discussing just because of time, but are here for you to pursue through reading. And then finally, at the end, there is a very long handout. It's got a colored page separator, and then you find the Sacred Geometry Resource List. One of the things that I've sometimes been frustrated by in attending courses and trainings is that the instructor will often talk about different pieces of information that it's not always clear where they got that information from. Did they discover it themselves? Did it come from a particular source? And so one of the things I think that we need today in modern Western metaphysics is we need to start developing a cumulative body of knowledge. Because to be honest, there are quite a few pathologies in modern Western metaphysics. There's a great tendency to want to have one's own isolated group that one is the guru of, and one is the unquestioned teacher for that group. And this then leads to a lot of fragmentation of information. And I think we're at the point now in Western metaphysics that we can and should get beyond that. We need to be able to accumulate the different pieces of knowledge held by different groups, teachers, etc., and bring them together to a central core body of knowledge that can be taught and communicated in a clear, concise form. In the same way that we have today with modern external science. In external science, you don't find conversations between people where they say things like, you know, I heard something about some guy named Einstein in Germany back 100 years ago, and he found out something, and it's in some book in German, but I've never really seen it. But I know some guy that read it, said it was really incredible. Everybody in physics knows what Einstein taught. It becomes part of a cumulative body of knowledge. So every year, new information gets brought into the central focus of every discipline, biology, chemistry, physics, until there's really a cumulative knowledge that people can be trained in. And starting from that in their education, then what they do from that point on adds in the next piece of the puzzle for everybody. And we then have this forward development of our knowledge base. And I think we really need that right now. So one of the things that we need to do is to appreciate the life work of all the people that have come before us, who have sacrificed really their entire life of time and energy into finding different pieces of the puzzle. And so we've worked on this resource list, which is still very far from complete, but nonetheless it still runs to over 60 pages. And it goes through the different topic areas we just discussed, and I've listed a number of texts in these different areas, and we've tried to get a good selection of books here for this training related to some of these pieces of knowledge, because I find that many of the books that have the most important pieces of knowledge are quite hard to find. You don't often find them at your average bookstore. And also, if you do see them, you can have the problem that you don't know which ones have what information. Because it could be that the first half of the book really has nothing very exciting or interesting, but there on page 87, there is like this amazing revelation the person had. And so with this, we want to give you some sense of the resources that are available and some of the important things that are held in some of these resources. Now, again, another aspect of this is that we want to make sure that a tragedy that I've seen recurring multiple times in modern Western metaphysics ceases to be the case. And that is that you will often find that people spend years of research and work, sometimes recreating the wheel, or doing work that's already been done. But because we don't know what work's already been done, there is no cumulative knowledge base, there is no resource guide, we don't know someone else has already done that body of work. And so if we can start from the current state of the art and travel forward from there, then we can accomplish a lot more and not waste our time and effort, because that's very important. One of the background concepts that I work with all the time, and that is going to be a background concept for us at this course, is that I personally feel that all of us have a particular spiritual calling. We have a particular task, a particular mission in life. And so what I do with sacred geometry knowledge might be very, very different from what you do. One person's going to apply it for health and healing. Another person's going to apply it to spiritual initiation. Another person's going to apply it for actually building buildings and designs and forms. And so the same body of knowledge is essential for all of us, but how we apply it is going to change from person to person. And so what we've done in this course is I've tried to bring together a lot of the pieces of the puzzle of this divine language of sacred geometry so that in 7 days you can get a concise overview and move from there. So we're going to be covering a lot of material in these 7 days. And what I'm going to request of you is that because we're going to be really compressing a lot of information over these 7 days, I'm going to ask you to please not interrupt the lecture and slideshow portion with questions. We will take questions at the end of every day. And I know that sometimes you're afraid, well, I'll forget the question if I don't ask it now. But the way that we're doing this, we're going to cover so many pieces of the puzzle that we're going to, in a sense, using a Rosicrucian metaphor, we're going to walk a circle around a particular topic and see it from multiple perspectives. And if we stop too long to go down side roads, we're going to lose the vision of how it's all getting linked together. Because that's one of our main missions here in this concise overview course, is how the pieces link together. Could I get the lights turned out? Whoever knows where the lights are. And we're going to start with our slideshow. Elizabeth, okay, great. And how about the wall sconces?
Actually, the sconces are in
So in this course, I'm going to be starting from the very beginning, the very basics. Some of you already have a strong background in sacred geometry, some of you do not. So we're going to start at the very beginning and build up bit by bit. Also, some of you are here for the first time working with us. Others of you have done multiple trainings with us in the past. So at times I am going to make side notes for those of you that have trained with us in the past in other topics, including Egyptian biogeometry, to link particular topics in sacred geometry directly to things that we've discussed before. And if you haven't taken those trainings with us, you might find it interesting as well. So let's start with the basic concept of sacred geometry itself. The actual name, sacred geometry, literally means the sacred measure of the earth, geometry. And so from one perspective, sacred geometry, the sacred measure of the earth, has to do with the literal creation of the physical earth itself. What we have in religious doctrines such as Genesis, with the actual process by which non-physical spiritual forces manifest the material world through specific forms. But also, the sacred measure of the earth also refers to the way that earth becomes a metaphor for the material plane itself. So the sacred measure of the earth is something we also see related to things we'll discuss later today from the Egyptian mysteries, for example, in which particular activities in sacred geometry are literal recreations of how spirit moves to manifest within three-dimensional reality, not just on the earth, but for all of three-dimensional creation in the entire universe of the three-dimensional world. Sacred geometry also refers to how spirit manifests life and consciousness through specific shapes and patterns. So one part of sacred geometry is very specifically geometry, its shapes and its patterns. So we're going to, in the last 5 days of the course, go piece by piece through specific patterns and shapes used in sacred geometry. Fibonacci ratio, phi ratio, Platonic solids, the Vesica, the three sacred roots of the Pythagoreans, all these sorts of things. And you'll be exploring those hands-on with Jane. But also, when we deal with patterns, patterns is not only geometry in a literal sense, but patterns relates to all patterns. And that includes things like music. Music has a pattern to it. All manifested life has a pattern. time is a pattern. And so that also is part of the study of sacred geometry, is the study of all patterns that are used to manifest life and activity. And another important point here, if you take a look at classical illustrations of the Godhead creating the world, then in many cases you will see the Godhead holding the compass. And the reason for this is that the compass allows you to create a stable center that then gives you a perfect rotation around a stable central point, which is the first movement of creation. The first letter of the divine alphabet of sacred geometry is the circle and the sphere, which we're going to get to on Monday as we start going through the literal shapes and patterns of creation. I want to then make a connection with that for those of you who have done the biogeometry course, where we find there that in Egyptian biogeometry we use the phrase, "This center is a transcendental gateway beyond space and time." And we find that that is actually quite literally true, that the actual energy coming from the center of a defined space has 3 specific energy qualities. And for those of you that have not done that course, we'll do a quick summary of that tomorrow with the energy science of sacred geometry. But this use of the compass to create a rotational movement around a center is very important for us. Because what it does is it allows us to create a boundary. And for all shapes in sacred geometry, the boundary principle is very important. You have created a defined space by creating that boundary, and the first primal boundary is that of a perfect circle or sphere, because in that case, the boundary is completely uniform in distance from the center. It's a completely uniform surface. And so one of the primal concepts here is that the Godhead is the undifferentiated source of all existence. And so as you see here in this depiction of Walter Russell's at the top, with the one coming from the central sphere and radiating out all of creation. In the Greek tradition, they use the literal term the one, with one in all capital letters, for their representation of the Godhead. It's from the one that we then create what the Chinese call the 10,000 things. The 1 becomes the 2 becomes the 4 becomes the 8, and this multiplication process then gives rise to everything in manifest creation. We're looking at that more on Monday as we go into principles like the Chinese I Ching, and going from unity to polarity to multiplicity. But the core of everything, the one, is what we access through that central point. And so again, we see these forms of the circle, or the circle with the point in the center. And we'll see that circle with the point in the center in different traditions called the emblem of the sun, or the emblem of the Godhead, or the emblem of gold. And from an energy perspective, that dot in the center of the circle is what we might refer to as a circuit diagram. The same as if you're going to wire up an electrical device, you're going to have a circuit diagram for how the energy is going to flow in that device. And so by showing you the point in the center of the circle, it's showing you something related to how they're calling this the form of the Godhead, or the sun, or of gold. It's accessing that central point of the circle or the sphere, or even of a rotational movement, you can access the one. A very important concept here is that once we have defined a boundary, we have 2 movements. We have the movement from the center to the periphery, and from the periphery back to the center. This particular breathing from inside oneself to the outside, and from the outside to the inside, is a primal movement of creation that you'll be exploring with Elizabeth later today with eurythmy and movement. And we'll see multiple manifestations of this in the course. Now let's go to a deeper level of this concept of sacred geometry originating from the one, from the Godhead. And in many traditions it is described as originating from thoughts in the mind of God. And so to understand this concept of thoughts in the mind of God, there's the understanding, again, from many different traditions around the world, that the one, the Godhead, the unified source of all things, creates the manifest world first as an activity of thought. And you then find in these traditions that they will then show the way that the human being is a manifestation of the Godhead in a unique individualized form. And so the activity of the human mind is a kind of a spark from an ocean of divine fire, from the mind of the Godhead. And so we find various disciplines today in metaphysics that emphasize the power of the human mind, whether it's silver mind control, or whether it's science of mind, or Christian Science, many different disciplines emphasizing the power of the mind itself. And again, this comes from the way that our mind is a detachment from the unified source of the mind, of the thoughts of God. So when you see this concept in multiple traditions, it has multiple manifestations within that tradition for the practices that they do, for the things they actually teach their initiates in their closed groups. So that one aspect of this is that when we deal with pure sacred geometric forms, if we deal with the pure form of a circle, for instance, the Greeks would talk about this as an ideal form that lives in the spiritual world. It does not live in the physical world. The Greeks would talk about these ideal forms as archetypes that stand behind everything in manifest creation, because every circle in the manifest world will have a specific shape and size and color, but the archetype of the circle is beyond specific size, color, etc. It is the thought from the mind of God that gave rise to everything here. And at first this can seem like somewhat of an abstract philosophy, but the deeper we go into sacred geometry, we find that things that are often taught that actually devolved over time to being simply an abstract philosophy began as very powerful concepts that were directly applied for specific purposes within the great spiritual traditions of the world. And so using this concept, the sacred geometric forms themselves are thought forms from the mind of God that hold tremendous amounts of embedded content. One term that we'll be using in this course, that some of you are familiar with from previous courses with us, is the term of a packed thought form. And this is a term that I picked up from the French medical doctor Samuel Sagan at the Clair Vision School of Australia. And one of the concepts they use there is that these packed thought forms is something that we've all experienced. At some point in everyone's life, you've been working on a particular question or a problem over a period of time, and then very often you stop thinking about it, your mind moves away, you're doing something else, and in an instant you get a type of a download or a vision where you get a tremendous amount of packed information in a second. And to try to unpack that concentrated information you got in that instantaneous transmission could take you days, weeks trying to unpack it word after word, concept after concept to another person, but you got it as one whole in the moment that it was transmitted. And so this concept of a packed thought form is very important, because what we're going to see, particularly once we get into the week and looking at different manifestations of these letters of the divine alphabet, of these sacred geometric forms, is that these particular sacred geometric forms can in fact manifest themselves in many, many different ways. So when we have that idea of a sacred geometric form being a packed thought form, it becomes something related to the concept of a proteus in ancient traditions. A proteus is something that can take many different manifestations. And so one manifestation that they can take is that actual sacred geometric forms can become the blueprint for actual living beings. This becomes a somewhat complex topic. I'll just touch it very briefly right now, and then we'll move on and come back to it later. And that is, if you look, let's say, at Western metaphysics, if you look at the names of spiritual beings in Western metaphysics, the names of the angels that we have, for instance, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the names themselves describe the function of the being. Raphael is God heals. Michael is who is as God. The names of the archangels describe the function of God that is administered through that being. And so you will find in different traditions that there can be specific geometric patterns associated with these high spiritual beings. For instance, in the Hindu tradition, you have the form of the yantras. There will be a specific yantra for the being Ganesh, for example. Why is there a specific sacred geometric form associated with that being? And on Monday, I'll show you one way that this manifests, where you have the Vesica, two overlapping circles, that this duality with a perfect balance in the center actually manifests itself through specific spiritual beings. And the same thing is true for activities in the physical world. These archetypal forms of sacred geometry I'll be showing you in the coming days can manifest themselves in energy patterns in the human body. They can manifest themselves as activities in nature, and once again as actual spiritual beings themselves. So the sacred geometric form as a thought form in the mind of God becomes an archetypal blueprint of a pattern, of an activity or a function that can manifest in many different ways. Now, one of the extensions of this idea for us is that this is also linked to the human being developing the capacity to directly perceive packed thought forms and being able to directly perceive geometric blueprints and archetypes. This is described by many different traditions. And in many of the illustrations that might accompany this concept, particularly in the East, if you look particularly in the Tibetan or the Himalayan tradition, is they will often show the central column of energy in the person's energy field and specific placements of energy centers above the head at which it's possible to develop the capacity to perceive these spiritual packed thought forms and to perceive geometric blueprint archetypes. And again, many of you have already experienced this. After any course I do of this kind, people always come up to me and say, you know, that pattern that you showed us, I was given that pattern by a particular teacher from the Vedic tradition. Or someone will say, I actually saw that pattern in my meditation, or I got that pattern in a dream. So we can access those forms all the time, but we can also develop the centers of potential in our energy field that the stronger they get, the more we can begin to focus in and perceive these types of geometric blueprints or thought forms. Now, because of this, in schools like the Greek Pythagorean school of initiation, which actually comes out of information that Pythagoras was taught in the Egyptian temples and in Babylon, in that particular Pythagorean school, they considered it to be impossible to have full initiation without an understanding of geometry, because it was that geometry that provided the blueprint to understand how all the functions of spirit manifest our world. And so sacred geometry from this perspective becomes the blueprint for how everything manifests. Now, in the classical world, and I'll take the next slide, this leads to a couple of consequences. One consequence is that once you understand how something works and you can affect its structure, then you have to be very careful that you only try to manipulate that for positive outcomes. And so because of the concern about this knowledge being used to manipulate people or natural events for negative purposes, a concern about black magic, this information was never taught to the public. The information was always taught in closed circles. However, with the fullness of time, many of the patterns of creation that we're going to see were taught in the old spiritual schools, as I mentioned before, have now been rediscovered in modern science and technology, which means that the information is already coming out, and it's being, to be honest, in many cases terribly misused. I'll be showing you patterns later on related to biology, chemistry, physics, etc. And we're having a tremendous destabilization of the Earth's natural energetic web by this application of these patterns discovered in modern science of technology without an understanding of the effects that's going to happen with these types of applications. And so some of you might have read the article that we sent out in our newsletter, in which I said that from my perspective, one reason why sacred geometry not only can be taught now publicly, but it should and must be taught, is because we are so rapidly destabilizing the natural environment through the science and technology that if the people that want to use it for good are not given the core information, then the outcome is not going to be positive at all. Once we understand the structure of something, we can affect it energetically. So we're going to be looking at structures during this week. Now, a classical concept of the relationship between the creative spiritual forces and the manifestation of the material plane is that of macrocosm and microcosm, the Hermetic maxim of as above, so below, as within, so without. Often represented like this, where you'd have something like the Star of David, the six-pointed star, one triangle up, one triangle down, showing this relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm, with the idea that everything in this world is a kind of a condensation, a lower vibratory rate of a reflection of something from higher worlds. And understanding this relationship, this link between the higher worlds and this world, we come to the concepts of sacred geometry, where what we do in sacred geometry is a recreation of what the Godhead and higher spiritual beings did in creating this world in the first place. So here we see William Blake's painting of the Godhead, the Ancient of Days, holding the compass. And here we see a medieval representation of the sacred geometer holding the compass and creating the circular movement with the triangle, holding the square, holding the circle, with the creation of the human being inside of it. And this is something that Jane is going to emphasize for you in doing the actual sacred geometry drafting, is this idea from classical times that the work that we are doing in the drafting is not just drawing little pictures. The actual movements that we are making are literally the same movements made by higher spiritual forces in creating things in this world. And by doing this type of work, we move beyond the level of seeing the external appearance of things in this world and see the actual, again, blueprint or the mechanics of how everything in this world actually operates. And this was an idea that then got brought into modern science. So you'll see pictures like this also for the dawn of modern science, with being able to understand the actual machinery of the physical world in chemistry, biology, and physics. But this had been pursued for thousands of years previous to that, but never made public in spiritual schools around the world. So some of you have seen this particular demonstration before, and for those of you that haven't, we'll go through it now. This is a particular blueprint pattern for something in the manifest world. And it's going to illustrate our concept of pattern recognition. Once we get a basic level of knowledge in sacred geometry, we develop the capacity to perceive the patterns behind everything in our world. And so we can then, through pattern recognition, find hidden links between things in manifest creation. So what we see here is one particular geometric outline, and there's a six-sided enclosure, and there's a five-pointed star coming downward and another five-pointed star going upward, and other forms inside of it. The little calculations at the bottom have to do with the relationship to the phi ratio, but we're not going to talk about phi and Fibonacci and the sacred roots and things of that kind until we get to the week, when we can start doing the drafting practices and make it very straightforward. But just look at the pure pattern and just silently ask yourself the question, if this pattern was to manifest into something in the material world, what would it be? And I'll take the next slide. And it's the geometric blueprint of this woman's face. This is from a book called The Geometry of Art and Life. And the thing about this particular analysis is that human faces are similar to snowflakes, in the sense that every snowflake is crystallized water that has a hexagonal form, but every snowflake has a different geometry. It's all based on the same core pattern of geometry, but the way it crystallizes is always unique, just like human fingerprints. And by the same token, the human face is crystallized spirit that is based on all faces having the same core geometry, but everyone is unique. And they've done tests, for instance, with young babies, where they'll show babies different faces. And if the eyes and the nose and the mouth and the ears are in the right place, then the baby smiles. But you put the mouth where the eye should be, something of that kind, then the child cries. There's an intuitive sense of the human being of how things should be arranged. And they're based on these types of blueprints. Now, once we understand these types of geometric blueprints that stand behind things, then we can start looking at, I'll take the next slide, seemingly unrelated phenomena and find these hidden links. So what we have here is from a book called The Temple at Jerusalem by John Michel. And the people that did this work knew nothing about the pattern I just showed you, and vice versa. Completely separate bodies of work that didn't know each other's material. And what they found here is that they were studying the sacred geometry of Jerusalem. And what you see at the left is the way that Jerusalem is laid out as a six-sided enclosure with a five-pointed star going up and a five-pointed star going down. It's the same basic pattern as the human face itself. Now, from our normal, logical, linear thinking, that doesn't compute. Why would the geometry of the human face be the same as the geometry of Jerusalem? But it has to do, from my meditation upon it, one aspect of it has to do with the way that spirit expresses itself in matter. If you want to understand the nature of a person, you don't tend to look at their knee or their elbow or their left shoulder blade. You look at their face. By looking at their face, you get a sense of who that person is, because the face is where spirit expresses itself in flesh. And by the same token, Jerusalem is a holy site, and it's where spirit expresses itself on the flesh of the planet. And so there's a particular relationship here with the six-sided enclosure and the five-pointed star form. And we'll be talking more about what this all means with the nature of the six and the nature of the five and how nature uses that to manifest things. I just wanted to show this right now to give you a sense of pattern recognition. That once you can see the geometric blueprint behind things and you find these hidden linkages, you're beginning to see the way that spirit works in the world and lays down these blueprints, and that there are these hidden connections between things. It's the same thing we talked about for those of you that did the biogeometry course, where we began to talk about linkages between phenomena that to begin with we don't think of as being linked, such as the nature of the BG3 energies, blessing and prayer, positive states of thought and emotion, connecting to the center of a circle, a specific angle, things of that kind. All these things linked to the same energetic. So this brings us to our concept that we looked at just a moment ago, where we have thought forms in the mind of God, and then around it we have different expressions of the sacred geometric mystery, different contexts at which people in modern circles will look at sacred geometry to try to understand it. And it's interesting to note that, to be honest, in the very recent past, sacred geometry was a very obscure topic. If you talk to most people, even in metaphysical circles in the 1970s, people didn't know what sacred geometry was. It really wasn't until the mid-1980s there began to be talk of sacred geometry. And today it's a bit of a buzzword, and you see a lot of books with sacred geometry in the title, or talking about one aspect of sacred geometry. So there are a lot of bits and pieces of sacred geometry knowledge out today, but what's hard to find is the context that links all the pieces together. So that's what we're going to try to look at here. So what we've come to now is looking at the idea of sacred geometry as a divine language, the alphabet of creation. As I mentioned before, one way I'd like you to think about it is that it is literally a divine language, and literally actually an angelic language, that all the shapes that make up our world, all those shapes that are blueprints from the mind of God, the archetypes that the Greeks talked about, every one of those is like a letter of an alphabet. And if you study a person's energy field, or you study the construction of a flower in nature, really to study any living energy system, or even the structure of things that are inanimate like minerals, you will find that they are composites of specific shapes that have specific functions being brought together to be the energy totality of that thing that you're looking at. Now this is related to some concepts that some of you have heard me talk about before, related to the Egyptian mysteries. This summer at our Vesica summer intensive, we looked at the different subtle bodies from the Egyptian perspective, from the old Egyptian temple science. And we found that one of the subtle body layers that the Egyptians discussed was something called the Ren, the name. And the name has to do with something that in later times in the Jewish Kabbalistic world is going to be called the mystery of the Kabbalistic word, with the idea that every sound that we have in creation, every sound, what they would call a seed syllable in the Himalayan tradition, has a particular sound, it has a particular energy function. And so a literal name, when it's the true Kabbalistic word, the true Kabbalistic name, is the set of sounds, each of which has a specific energy quality, that in their composite gives you the energy blueprint, the construction diagram of the thing itself. And that can be true either with sound, with a Kabbalistic word, or it can be true with patterns of actual geometry. And this is related also to the structure of the human energy field. People have different structures in their energy field that give them different capacities. And different traditions will work with their initiates to do particular practices so that they will structure their subtle bodies to be capable of specific things. That's why it's only half true to say that all spiritual traditions lead to the same goal. They all lead to spirit because there's no other place to go. But that doesn't mean that you get your subtle body structured the same in different traditions, because everything you do with your awareness and your attention structures your subtle body. So that any practice that you do on a regular basis, you are reinforcing a specific pattern in your subtle body that will give you a specific ability over time based on how you're using your awareness and your attention. So a very important background concept for us. So getting back to this core idea of sacred geometry as a divine alphabet, every shape has a specific purpose in nature. And again, what we're going to do in the final 5 days of the course is go through some of the most important shapes, some of the most important letters that we find at every scale, from the subatomic up to the galactic, in manifest creation, because they're some of the primary functions that nature uses. Now, if you take a look at the illustration I have to the right here, this is an illustration of the cover of General Chemistry by Linus Pauling. And many of you have heard me give talks before where I talked about my background with this, in which I first became involved with sacred geometry in the U.S. Marine Corps as an instructor in the nuclear, biological, chemical warfare. And looking at physics, biology, and chemistry, I simply found that there are specific geometric patterns that have been empirically discovered, really empirically rediscovered, by modern science and technology that show you all the different functions in physics, biology, and chemistry. And so this is simply an illustration of that with this textbook by Linus Pauling. This is a particular chemical compound that's shown with the form in the center that we're going to be introduced to later. It's the form of the octahedron, and then around it is the form that's called the stella octangula, and later renamed by Leonardo da Vinci as the star tetrahedron. And so these classical sacred geometric forms taught in the old spiritual traditions, again being empirically rediscovered as the literal basis of everything in creation in biology, chemistry, and physics today. So again, these are the letters of the divine alphabet. And this also leads to a couple of consequences. One is that I have seen spiritual initiates from different traditions unable to communicate to each other in an earthly language, but able to communicate to each other through specific geometric patterns or forms that they've both been taught in their traditions and they both recognize. And by the same token, what is sometimes taught in these classical traditions is that by learning this language of shape, form, geometry, because this is a creative language of the higher spiritual hierarchies, it is a literal angelic language, so that in communication with higher realms, we are given downloads that are purely geometric in nature. And we have to be able to analyze those and understand it. And so to communicate with higher beings, to do so in a geometric language, is a much easier form of communication for them than in an earthly language. It's the language they already speak, the language they already use to create our world. Now let's go one level deeper. A moment ago we talked about this form often being discussed, and that's a true principle of creation, but it can also be a simplification. So there's another layer we can go to here. Because what you'll find sometimes is that, for instance, in this particular diagram that comes from the work of the Rosicrucian adept Rudolf Steiner, you have the microcosm, which is linked to a 5-pointed star, the macrocosm to a 6-pointed star, and we'll get into the mystery of the 5- and 6-pointed star later. You have the Godhead. And so now you have 3 levels: microcosm, macrocosm, and the Godhead. And so if you look at something like this classic painting by Raphael, you see that there's a representation of 3 levels. So here's the level at which the human beings are, then's the level of the saints with the Christ, and above it, the level of the Godhead. This is a very important aspect of Western esotericism today. Christian esotericism is understanding this particular format, where there are actually 3 layers. Now, this is understood by particular traditions in different ways. And to keep it simple, I'll just talk about one way right now. And that is, one part of macrocosm and microcosm is that we have reflected in the form of the human physical body and subtle bodies things that come from higher worlds. And I'll give you illustrations of that later this weekend, and many of you are familiar with this already, that the different energy centers of the human body come, for instance, with the chakras connection to the planets, or to the different acupuncture channels connected to the signs of the zodiac in some of the Asian teachings. That essentially there are things that we can see out in physical space as a physical macrocosm that's reflected in our structure in the physical and subtle body microcosm. But beyond that is something that is purely spiritual. And that's a very important concept, that we might have reflections of things that also exist in the physical world, but behind those things are always the spiritual level itself that is non-physical. If you go back to the early teachings in esoteric Christianity, back to the first few centuries after the appearance of Christ, where they were still trying to figure out this mystery of what is the solar logos, what is the Christos, you will find writings such as those of the great church father Origen, writing from Egypt. And in Origen's writing, he has a wonderful book called On First Principles. And in On First Principles, he says, the nature of the Christ is such that the Godhead is so vast in all of creation that the human being cannot directly interact with a being of that vastness. So what the Christ being is, the solar logos, is all the attributes of the Godhead reduced in scale to the level there is a being that we can now interact with directly. And so this is also related to this concept later coming out here in this painting of Raphael's, of this intermediary level, where the Christ becomes the intermediary between the one, the Godhead, and humanity. But all three being of the same nature, the same qualities in this stepping down process from the one to the macrocosm to the microcosm is being present. And so this is going to be important because in this course we're going to be going into some of the macrocosmic sources of things here in the microcosm. But always beyond it is that third level, the purely spiritual. Which means that literally our physical body is made as a detachment from the material plane. The food we take in as physical substance gets converted into the physical body itself. Then from the ambient etheric life energy, we take in the etheric energy to become our body of life energy, which again in the West is often called the etheric, and in the East could be called chi, ki, prana, things of that kind. Again, though it's detachment from a force from the higher world that I individualize in this lifetime and make it a vehicle for my activity. And except for the part that I individualize, it will break up after death and go back to its source, just as the physical body breaks up after death and goes back to the earth. Then the next level in some parts of the Western tradition will be called the astral. And when it's simply the astral as a whole, it refers to the consciousness of the human being. And then the ego with a capital E refers to the spiritual core of the human being. So all of these are considered to be detachments from higher realms. Again, we'll go into more detail in this model tomorrow. And Jane is also going to do a drafting practice with you that shows how this model relates to the tree of life. So it's a core concern of every spiritual tradition, every major spiritual tradition on the planet talks about the context of not only the physical body of the human being with the subtle bodies and the energetic context around us and spiritual context, but also the context for the actual physical world that we live in with the planets and the constellations and the greater world outside of us. So if you study Taoist yoga or you study Hindu yoga or many other types of energetic systems, there'll be particular things that you do to connect energetically to the forces of specific planets, constellations, etc. So particular aspects of this are our local geometric context for life on Earth. So we have the Earth, which is in its position within the solar system, which has a position within the galaxy. Actually, it's on one of the outer spiral arms of the Milky Way galaxy, which is part of a local group of galaxies, which is within a larger cluster, etc., all the way up to the observable universe. Directly around the Earth itself, we have a projection of the Earth's equator outward, which becomes the celestial equator, and then we have the plane of the ecliptic, where we can actually trace the movement of the sun against the background. And this becomes a very important concept for many spiritual traditions. So that when we trace out the sun's movement against the background in the heavens, then that gives us the plane of the ecliptic, which out of all of the stars around us isolates a particular band of 12 groups of stars, which become the zodiac. And so it's that relationship of the sun's apparent movement as we see it against the background that isolates these particular energetic forces around us in cosmic space. And from that, we then move to the concept of the precession of the equinox, a very important concept that is central not only in the Western tradition, but many parts of the East as well. Everyone's heard about the concept of the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius that we're supposed to be moving into, etc. And it has to do with particular time rhythms on the earth. So when we start dealing with concepts common to many spiritual traditions, it has to do with the way that time and space move together. And so the way that the earth has a particular tilt on its axis, 23 degrees and some change, and then the way it's then rotating on its axis and it's moving around the sun leads to particular constants. And one of these is the way that at the time of the vernal equinox, there's a pointing to a particular part of the constellations in the heavens. And this pointing to a part of the zodiac at a particular time of the year actually moves backward a little bit every year. So it's not procession, which would be a forward movement, it's precession, which is a backward movement. That's how come we are currently in the age of Pisces. And if we were going forward, the next would be the age of Aries. But it's precession, so it's actually going backwards. So now the next stage is the age of Aquarius. So that connection to that particular zodiacal sign, that particular constellation, connects us to certain types of energies. And so what we see here is just a demonstration of that, where at a particular time period, we then would look out to the heavens, and where we would see the connection at the vernal equinox is in this particular sign here, around Taurus the bull. And this will actually change over time. So again, over time we've continued to move backwards, so that in old mythology they talked about the quest for the golden fleece, connected to the age of Aries. Then we had the time of the Christ, which was the age of the fish, and the fish symbol of Christianity. And now moving to the age of Aquarius with this backward movement. And as we move to these different ages, certain types of spiritual development on the planets change over time. What's important to understand that this is related to the geometry of time and space, so that when you get down to the core of it, much of the background concepts of why things happen at the time and place that they do, taught by different spiritual traditions, has to do with the geometry of time and space. In fact, the entire mystery of astrology is really a mystery of the geometry of time. Because over time, different planets will move into different positions. And those positions are then marked by specific geometric relationships. We say that it's sextile or it's conjunct, or whatever is a particular angle that these planets are at. And then the forces of those two planets, depending on the angle, gives a certain energetic effect. So it's a geometric mystery that changes over time. The angle changes and the energetic effect changes with the angle. This is also something that is part of a universal mystery of the energy science, which means that we can also work with variable angles energetically. And one person might need a specific angle in their energy field at a particular time that will balance energy functions in their body. Or if you're building in sacred architecture, a particular angle will have a specific energy quality, a different angle will have a different energy quality for that location. But the basic concept we're dealing with now, I'm just trying to tie a few dots together, is this idea of the context and cosmic space around us. And this then gives way to our understanding that not only is our movement with the precession of the equinox, which lasts 25,920 years, and all of these types of years and days, types of counts that are kept by different traditions, with the Hindus keeping the count of the 4 ages of Kali Yuga and other ages, with the Mayans keeping the count related to Venus and galactic center, with the Egyptians keeping a count connected to the star Sirius. All these counts are related to certain numbers that are constants and have energy effects. We then move to the level of the planets. And in fact, even the names of the days of the week, for us to keep track of our time with one solar cycle after the next solar cycle, the sun rises and the sun sets, every day is related to one of the planets of the solar system. Saturn, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus. Gives us Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And actually what stands behind this, which is too much to get into at the moment, but taught in Rosicrucianism, is that these particular names not only stand for things in our solar system currently, they also stand for particular stages of cosmic evolution of the Earth in earlier time periods. So that old Saturn is the time period that the current orbit of the planet Saturn covers a certain range of cosmic space. And in a very early period of our solar system being formed, there is simply a globe of heat that expanded to fill the space that is now marked by the actual orbital range, diameter, of the orbit of the planet Saturn. So there's many mysteries within mysteries embedded in this, but the main concept of what you take away right now is that our fundamental concepts of understanding time and space on the planet are related to our cosmic context with the constellations and to the planets. So that it was understood in classical traditions that around the Earth itself we had all of the different planets of the solar system. Now often today we talk about the way that the ancients didn't understand celestial dynamics because they put the Earth at the center rather than the sun. But we live on the Earth, so that is our center. And so there's a validity to what they saw at the time. It's not true that everything revolves around us, but it is true that as a human being living on what Buckminster Fuller called spaceship Earth, as we move through the cosmos, from our perspective, we are the center and we see things outside of us. And so we then have the different spheres of the planets arranged outside of us. And initiation in the ancient world, when you would go through stages, at the first stage of initiation, you would be the raven. And so in the Old Testament, they have stories of Elijah lost in the wilderness and his encounter with the raven, showing that's a first stage of initiation for him. And then moving to connect to these different planetary spheres. So again, connection to the local context in space, related to our understanding of time, related to spiritual initiation, to all of these different functions. But also with this idea that around the Earth, arranged outside of us, are these spheres of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, etc. This was a core concept for the Greeks and other traditions, because when they actually got to the stage where they could experience out-of-body travel or conscious travel out of the body past the Earth itself, they knew they moved through certain spheres in higher worlds. And this became a teaching that was passed down to the priesthood to help people after death. And so because of that, this becomes a teaching that you find in texts such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The actual name of the book is better called the Book of Coming Forth by Day. But in this illustration from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you'll see that there are 7 gateways that have to be passed through. Now that's because as you pass through, the spiritual aspect behind this movement out through the solar system, what the Greeks would describe as these planetary spheres, you could experience it purely as a series of portals to move through, as gateways to go through. You might not even be aware that they're related in the physical world to the spheres of the planets. But it's, again, this is related to our concept of microcosm, macrocosm, and then the spiritual world beyond. The spiritual aspect beyond the physical planets, and this journey that can be taken by everyone after death or by the initiates while they're still incarnated. They needed to know in the Egyptian tradition the nature of the gateways and the names and functions of their gatekeepers. So when we're talking about the construction of the solar system around us, there's been the understanding for as long as we have recorded history of spiritual traditions, particularly getting back to Egypt, of the understanding that these particular planetary spheres have their positions and their activities according to a subtle blueprint of geometry behind them. And many people are familiar with the work of Kepler, where Kepler talked about the way that the planets are spaced out according to constants of particular geometric forms. So you have the dodecahedron, icosahedron, tetrahedron, cube, etc. And you can find a lot of references today to Kepler's work on these harmonics of space and how the actual position of the planets are related to these geometric forms. And in saying this, Kepler was actually giving out publicly the type of material that had been talked about privately in spiritual traditions for thousands of years. Now again, don't worry too much about the names of these shapes if you're not familiar with them yet. Later on in the course, you're going to be building these shapes. We'll go into them in quite some detail. But the idea right now is understanding this concept of the geometric forms giving the blueprint that's related to the actual spacing of the orbits of the planets. And this is understood often as the harmony of the spheres, that the actual movement of the planets in their given orbits have a musical harmonic relationship one with the other. And so if you get into the esotericism of music, you'll find many, many references from many different traditions having to do with the way that the solar system and the constellations are a celestial choir, and it's all based on musical principles. And so Kepler also talked about this. This is Kepler's Heavenly Harmonies, where he made relationships to particular constants in the musical scale related to the forces of the planets. So I want to give you some illustrations now from a modern work, which is really a wonderful book called A Little Book of Coincidence by John Martineau. And he calls it A Little Book of Coincidence because in research done by some people before him and then further work done by John Martineau, they found that there were all of these exquisite geometric relationships that with modern calculations could be shown to exist, to where it's very clearly the case that there are these pure geometric archetypes that give the positions of the planets and validate these ancient concepts. And every time that he would show this to scientists and mathematicians, they'd say, well, isn't that a strange coincidence that these geometric forms give the exact placement of the planets and orbits and these types of things? So that was always their excuse. They say, well, it's just a coincidence. So he calls this a little book of coincidence, and he collects these things together. So I want to show you a few of these. One is he gives this wonderful diagram of the dances of the planets as seen from the Earth. If you were to see the actual way that these planets move one with the other, they make these beautiful movements in the heavens. So if you had like a time-lapse photography, you could see these geometric patterns being made with their movements with each other. They're literally the dances that these planets make with one another, seen enacted in cosmic space. But it goes well beyond this. And so one of the best known illustrations of this, that's even spoken of in the Da Vinci Code and other very popular works that only go to a superficial level with this type of inquiry, is the way that the movement of Venus, as seen from the Earth, gives you the form of a pentagram. Now for this diagram and the others I'm about to go into, for time purposes, I'm not going to go into all of the description of the harmonics and shapes and things of that kind. I just want you to get the general idea. And those of you that are interested in looking into it further, then please look up this book, A Little Book of Coincidence. The basic idea is that as seen from the Earth, with the Earth rotating and moving around the sun, and with Venus rotating and moving around the sun, that Venus makes this five-pointed star movement as seen from the Earth. And interestingly enough, if we then get that form of the five-pointed star and make around it another five-pointed star, because there's this beautiful geometry as a pure thought form of the Godhead, that inside of every five-pointed star is a pentagon that's upside down. And inside that upside-down pentagon is a perfect upside-down pentagram. But inside that upside-down pentagram is a right-side-up pentagon. And inside of that right-side-up pentagon is a right-side-up pentagram. So it's this perfect fractal form. One fits inside of the other. That's part of cosmic creation. And so if around that five-pointed star related to the movement of Venus, we then create the larger five-pointed star that it fits inside, we could then take a compass and around the sun make a circle, and it would show us the exact movement that's accurate in physical space as far as the range of the closest point of Venus in its orbit and the farthest part of Venus in its orbit from the Earth. And these types of relationships are over 99% mathematically accurate. So we see in this case the perfect relationship of Venus's movement in cosmic space related to the Earth, related to the form of the pentagram. Now if we get the form of the pentagon and we nest pentagons inside one another, there are particular harmonics that we get with distance according to the pure shape, and then create a circle around it. Two nested pentagons define the distance of empty space between Mercury and Venus, between Mars and Ceres, and relative mean orbits of Earth and Mars from this particular relationship. Three nested pentagons define the space between Venus and Mars in their orbits. The accuracy of these relationships is greater than 99%. Here's one for Jupiter. Jupiter has two asteroid clusters called the Trojans that follow its orbit at exactly 60 degrees in front and 60 degrees behind. That gives you perfect points of a hexagram with Jupiter. Now the thing is, if you then create two hexagrams, because just like the pentagon, the hexagon holds inside of it a rotated hexagram, holding inside of it a hexagon with a right side up hexagram, etc., etc. It's a constant cycle. If you have two hexagrams perfectly nested in the outer hexagram, that gives you an internal circle of the innermost hexagon. And that circle gives you Earth's mean orbit vis-a-vis Jupiter. And this is 99.8% accurate. So what you get here, by putting the hexagon and the hexagon and the hexagon, when you get to here, this is the almost exactly perfect distance between the orbit of Jupiter and that of Earth. So this shows you these incredible constants. A sphere holding the size of Jupiter's orbit can hold three perfectly nested forms that are Platonic solids we'll be talking about later: the cube and the octahedra. Everybody knows what a cube is. An octahedra is just two pyramids connected base to base. The sphere touching the center of the faces of the inmost form, and you can do it with a cube. Inside of it's an octahedra, inside of it's a cube, or you can do it with an octahedra, inside of it is a cube, inside of it's an octahedra. It doesn't matter. Works either way. The sphere touching the center of the faces of the inmost form gives the correct size of the Earth's orbit when the outer sphere is the size of Jupiter's orbit. Again, perfect geometry. And one more. This gets a little bit more complex. I'm not going to go into detail on it. It's in the book. But there are two very important forms we'll be talking about later with the Platonic solids, or perfect three-dimensional forms. One's an icosahedron, which has 20 triangular faces, and one's a dodecahedron with 12 pentagonal faces. And essentially, if you use these forms of creation and combine them with the form of the sphere, the first form of creation, without going into all the details right now, the upshot of it is that they will, by creating the sphere, the diameter of Mars' orbit, depending on the form you put inside and working with the spheres. A sphere placed inside the dodecahedron will give you the correct diameter of Venus's orbit, 99.98% accurate. And the center of the sphere is creating an icosahedron, create a sphere with the correct diameter of Earth's orbit vis-a-vis Mars, and that's 99.9% accurate. So this leads us to an important concept in sacred geometry, which is squaring the circle. Squaring the circle relates to the basic concept of how spirit manifests into form. And so classical traditions talking about squaring the circle, in the largest idea that they're discussing is the way that non-physical spirit manifests the physical world. And so the sphere, the first form of creation, represents spirit. It's the perfect boundary. It's the container for all of creation. And then the square, or the cube, represents actual materialization, the creation of the material plane. And I say that it represents it, so this part of this is philosophical. But as we'll see later on in the course, there's a lot of this that actually relates to literal processes as well. And so when you square the circle, you do an operation where if you were to take a string and put it outside on the boundary of the cube and get how far the string goes on the boundary, and then you did the same thing with the form of the circle, it would be the exact same length of string. So that squaring the circle is, in a sense, connecting and rectifying the form of materialization with the square or cube, and the form of spirit with the sphere or the circle. And of course, the classical representation of this is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man picture, where he's showing that the form of the human being is related to the geometric harmonics on the one hand of the circle, and on the other hand, the form of the square, meaning that the human being is both spirit and matter, and in our form of our body and its dimensions, we bring together both the form of spirit and matter with the circle and square. Now this form of the squared circle is related to the alchemical mystery that's known as solve et coagula. And this basically just means dissolving and materializing or coagulating, and often represented as this type of serpent or dragon eating its own tail. So there's a lot of embedded stuff here in this particular diagram related to alchemy. But the basic idea here is that this solve et coagula is the process by which the spiritual essence will coagulate to become something in the physical plane, the literal process of manifestation that everything in the physical plane went through to get here. And salva is the process by which it then dissolves and goes back up to spirit. So it's a philosophical concept only at its most abstract form. It's related to very, very specific activities that allow materialization and dissolving to take place. So squaring the circle is related to this whole mystery. How does spirit manifest in the physical world, and how do we go from the physical world back to spirit? This mystery is related very directly to the form of the cube. So we saw a minute ago that the square with the squared circle represented physical manifestation. Now, in a very literal sense, the cube is the representation of the material world, because the material world that we live in has 3 axes. And if you take electrical engineering courses, they'll have you put your thumb straight up, your index finger straight ahead, and your middle finger pointing to the side. And these are the 3 axes of physical space. That's why we say we live in a 3-dimensional world. There are 3 90-degree shifts that define our world. That's why when people talk about higher dimensions, the question is, well, where's the higher dimension? You can't show the 4th dimension in the physical world, not when the 4th dimension is a spatial dimension, because our world is based on the form of a cube. That means that there are only 3 90-degree angles. Now, one of the things that academia does, which is not very nice, is that they try to alienate the public by using a lot of jargon to represent terms that they could describe in plain language if they felt like it. And so that makes them feel special, and it justifies your spending $150,000 for your PhD in something. So only you understand it because only you know the jargon. One of those terms that you shouldn't let people get past you is the term orthogonal rotation. Orthogonal rotation just means a 90-degree shift. It's the simplest thing in the world. So if you see in technical materials or somebody talks about an orthogonal rotation, it's just a 90-degree shift in 2 axes. So there's orthogonal rotation here with the 90-degree shifts in the 3 axes of space. And if you were then to put a wall at the end of all 3 axes, you literally get the form of the cube. It's also related to the mystery of the 3 mother letters in the Jewish Kabbalah, Aleph, Mem, and Shin, which we'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow. But this idea of forming a form in the 3-dimensional world that human beings can incarnate in and that creation takes place in, it's understood in sacred geometry that that form that represents it and is quite literally the form of the cube. And this is that whole mystery of how did I get here? Because I am a spiritual being that is essentially non-physical, but I'm living in a physical body. And so spiritual traditions will talk about the entire context for this. That as part of a particular education process, in the way that many of these traditions describe it, at the time of incarnation we're given what they call the draft of forgetfulness. And so this draft of forgetfulness that's described, particularly in the Western tradition and older text, is where you have to forget who you are. And you get incarnated in a young child's body. Very innocent, but you don't have intellectual capacities. Everything is bright and new and trying to figure stuff out. And with that draft of forgetfulness, you got to start from the beginnings and learn certain lessons on earth. until you get to that point where once again you die, you go back to spirit, and the whole thing continues, and it creates this form of a helix. So you go through a circuit every time, but every time you go through it, you move up to the next higher octave. And so you're moving in the spiral form of creation. And so this idea of how is it that I ended up here in the box of the physical world got treated differently by different traditions. Some treated it as something that needed to happen because it's part of an education process. Other traditions treat it as something that happened either because of detrimental beings that tricked us, and that leads to the teaching of the Gnostics related to the demiurge, where the demiurge is the lord of this world and he kind of stuck us in the box and we got to figure out how to get out of the box. And then you have the teachings in the East that talk about this world is Maya, it's an illusion. Don't buy into the illusion, just get out of here. So this mystery of the squared circle and of the cube of the physical world and of the draft of forgetfulness where we get stuck in the cube and we have to go through our process, again, is related to many of these very important mysteries discussed by different traditions. And what it comes down to, that everybody has to make their own mind up, is was there a purpose for it, and what is that purpose? Or was it just all a mistake and I should get out of here? And that leads to different types of ascension concepts. Is it an ascension where it's all a mistake and I just want to get out of here as quickly as possible? Or is an ascension that's only possible after I go through certain stages of development and I alchemically transmute myself till I get to the final end product and then I naturally go? It's different concepts and different traditions. You got to make up your own mind. Now this is a particular picture by Walter Russell. We're looking at more of Russell's work later in this course. Great painter and esotericist in the first part of the last century. And in The Secret of Light, he has this depiction here. And this is from his direct spiritual visions. He says, the cube and sphere are one, being two opposite phases of the same thing. The cube is the sphere extended to black coldness, while the sphere is the cube contracted to white incandescence. It's an interesting perspective on this mystery. And if we take a look at the way it manifests in different traditions, then we can begin to understand what stands behind things like the great black cube of the Kaaba at Mecca. The Kaaba, the cube, at Mecca, this huge black cube, this is the most holy site for Islam. In fact, Mecca itself was a holy site for the entire planet before Islam ever existed. But with the advent of Islam, today you cannot go to Mecca unless you are Muslim. And this is the place that every Muslim is supposed to go one time in their life on the Hajj, the pilgrimage. And so there's a great black cube in the center of Mecca that they go to. And so now you have a little bit of background of what is the black cube. Why is the center of the Islamic mystery the journey to the black cube? You find other aspects of the black cube mystery in things like Judaism, where Orthodox Jews will put the form of the black cube on their body and they will do spiral windings around it in particular types of religious ritual. Now I also want to bring out something else here, and that is let's make a connection to this idea of the circle and the square with the forms of the Masons. And we'll talk more about the Masons tomorrow when we talk about sacred architecture. But the compass and square is the classic sign of the Masons. What the compass allows you to do is to make the circle. What the square allows you to do is to make the square. So one level of meaning of the circle and square of the Masons is this connection that they have understood the mystery of the squared circle, which at its deeper level means understanding how spirit created the material plane and how the material plane can reconnect to spirit. There's another layer of this too that I'll also mention again tomorrow, but I'll just say it in passing right now. For those of you that did the biogeometry course, then one of the things that we saw at that time is that any circular movement, any rotational circular movement creates a center, and that center will give you the energies that we called at that time the BG3. So what the compass is an instrument to create a connection to the BG3 energy when you're working energetically with structures and design. The square, with that 90-degree angle, is related to what we talked about in the biogeometry course, where the right angle, the 90-degree angle in a room, gives you what we called a negative green or spiritual carrier wave energy function from that right angle. So these are also energy tools. One of these tools allows the designer to design something that creates the BG3, that's the compass. The square allows you to design something that gives you the negative green carrier wave. And for those of you that didn't take the biogeometry course, I'll clarify this a little bit more tomorrow. Here's another interesting thing, another little cosmic epiphany having to do with the squared circle. And this is also from a little book of coincidence. There's the amazing thing that the cosmos has been so perfectly set up that as seen from the Earth, the moon and the sun are exactly the same size. So at the time of a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, the two perfectly cover each other up. Whereas in reality, the moon is fractionally the size of the sun. The sun is so much larger, but they are so perfectly positioned in cosmic space that they are exactly the same size. And that leads to the alchemical effect of sun and moon on the human race. And so you find in virtually every advanced spiritual tradition, they will talk about the alchemy of sun and moon and those forces in the human energy body, perfectly balanced. Now let's take it a little bit further. If we take the actual size of the moon and the size of the Earth, and we put the moon in the correct size on top of the Earth, and we actually create the form of the squared circle. We put a square around the Earth, and then we draw a circle going around with the compass point in the center of the circle and the lead touching the center of the moon. It perfectly squares the circle. So once again, perfect movement in cosmic space. Yes. That's okay. So while we're exploring these fundamental topics, there's another thing we should talk about, which is higher dimensions. And when people talk about higher dimensions, they often are talking about different things. Sometimes they mean time as a higher dimension. If you read like Einstein's works, the fourth dimension is time. But if we deal with higher dimensions as actually higher dimensions of space that we can't see or interact with directly in our three-dimensional box, the cube of the physical world, then this becomes a very important idea in metaphysical circles. And it has particular manifestations for us in geometry. At the end of the course, Thursday, Friday, we're going to get into a little bit more on hyperdimensional geometries and have you create some three-dimensional shadows of fourth-dimensional objects. Very important idea. The way this is often referred to is with the concept of Flatland. There's a book written named Flatland in the 1800s that was basically a metaphor for the way that a being that lived in a purely flat surface, and that was its pure reality. Our three-dimensional world would seem magical to it because we could just pop into existence and pop back out in the third dimension that it didn't have. And following that concept, you then had the Theosophists and other spiritual groups in the late 1800s work with the concept of how this fourth dimension can relate to things like the apparitions that they had in spiritual seances, where things would pop out of the ethers into physical existence and pop back out. And they describe it in terms of the fourth dimension. Again, they'd use the metaphor for how it would appear to a two-dimensional being seeing a three-dimensional object just pop into existence and pop back out by moving through the extra dimension. So they would talk about things like this. In the physical world, you can't get these two solid rings to go one inside of the other. But in the fourth dimension, they could link up together. And these kinds of things would happen in some of these spiritualistic seances. So they began to work with this concept of the fourth dimension. Again, we're going to mostly deal with this concept at the end of the course. But I just want to mention a couple of things about it right now. One is I want you to understand the basic idea of movement through dimensions. The point is said to have zero dimensionality. The point can be considered to be similar to the center in biogeometry, the transcendental gateway beyond space and time. But an actual point is considered to have no extent in physical space and to be zero dimensional. Then a line has one dimensionality. It just has one dimension of movement. Then the form of, let's say, a square. It could be a triangle, etc. But this form that can actually enclose space in a flat two-dimensional form, this form is two-dimensional. And this, for the first time, you can enclose space, but only two-dimensional space. Then a three-dimensional form in 3 dimensions can enclose 3-dimensional space. So what we've done is we've actually moved here through a particular series where you multiplied from point to point and you made a line, then line to line, connected it up, you made a square, square to square, connected it up, you got a cube, and then to make a 4th-dimensional object, a hypercube, you get one cube, then the next cube, and then connect them up with other cubes. And so this is a 2-dimensional representation of a 4th-dimensional object. And we'll have you build one of these 3-dimensionally at the end of the course. But I want to point out to you a couple of things here, just so you're clear on it. One is this whole idea of moving from 0 dimensions with the point, to 1 dimension with the line, to 2 dimensions with the plane, to 3 dimensions with the solid, to the 4th dimension with what's known as a hypersolid, or a hyperdimensional form. The other thing I want you to see is that what I have here is a 3-dimensional object represented on a 2-dimensional surface. This is a 4th-dimensional object represented on a 2-dimensional surface. So again, this is encoding information about a higher structure. I can actually build one of these in 3-dimensional space and show it to you, and you'd say, oh, okay, that is a shadow of the 3-dimensional form itself. But the same thing is true here. This is a 2-dimensional shadow of a 4th-dimensional object. And I want you to notice that it makes a particular form here. It makes the form of a rotated square. Some of you might recognize this idea from biogeometry. Here's a square here. Here's another square rotated on it. It gives you an 8-pointed form, an 8-pointed star. And so there's the idea that some forms we see in sacred geometry are simply a lower dimensional representation of a higher dimensional object, as much as we can see of it here in our dimensional projection. We could do the same thing. We could add dimensions by adding in axes. I have one axis, now I've got 2 axes, now I've got the 3 axes, which actually make the form of an octahedron, 2 pyramids base to base. But if I see it projected, not 3-dimensional, but 2-dimensional, it can look to me like a 6-pointed star. And then if I go ahead and add another axis in the 4th dimension, then I get this form here. So now I've got, once again, an 8-pointed star form. And finally, I could do the same thing just by adding points. I've got a point, I add another point, I make a line, add another point, and I get the simplest 2-dimensional form, which is a triangle. The simplest form you can make to enclose space with straight lines. I add another point, and I get the simplest 3-dimensional form with straight lines, which is a tetrahedron. Triangular base, another point above it, all connected up. It has 4 triangular sides. If I add a 5th point and I connect it up, I get a 4th-dimensional form. But if I see it projected into 2-dimensional space, it becomes a 5-pointed star. So what I want you to take away from it is this idea of movement through dimensions, and that a higher dimensional object in its projection in a lower dimensional space might look like another shape that you're familiar with. This brings us to spiritual initiation, the masters of the net. So we started with thought forms in the mind of God, moved to patterns, the divine alphabet of creation, and now we've come to spiritual initiation, the masters of the net. And what we want to do here is, we got about 15 minutes before we go to lunch, is we're going to start this conversation about the way that this knowledge of sacred geometry was then taught and transmitted in closed initiation groups. And we're particularly going to look at this Western lineage of the masters of the net. Now, to begin with, if we study modern science and physics, there's the understanding that what we call the Big Bang is often misunderstood by the general public, because the way the public tends to understand the Big Bang theory is that there's already an existing space that the Big Bang then filled up with all the stuff from the explosion, the movement from the center of the Big Bang. But scientists say, no, 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 that's not what we mean at all. There is no already existing space. There is no space or time before the Big Bang. Those of you that took the biogeometry course remember that we talked about this in part of the philosophy of biogeometry. What the scientists say is that actually space and time did not come into existence until after the Big Bang. Along with all the stuff that filled up the world was the actual space and time that goes with it. So that, in other words, before this, there is no space or time. Space and time expands outward along with all the stuff inside of it. It's not already existing. Now for us, this is very hard to conceive of. In our normal consciousness, We can't really think of things very well outside of space and time. We are so conditioned to space and time. But virtually every spiritual tradition assures us that there are conditions of existence beyond space and time. And so one of the ways that we deal with this concept of space and time is that space and time create a type of a net or an envelope. Shown here in the scientific illustration, it creates from a point, it moves to the form of a sphere. And that sphere has a grid to it. And this then, in modern science, is referred to as the matrix of space-time. Space-time is then shown as a kind of a grid structure that can be warped according to things that have mass. A planet, the sun, etc., anything that has mass actually warps space-time. So in other words, there is the basis of all existence is space-time, which is based on geometry. So if you study the work of Einstein and modern physics, everything is based on the geometry of space-time. And instead of matter being the essential nature of everything in our world, matter, because it has mass, actually creates distortions in space-time. Now what stands behind this at a deeper level is you can actually engineer space-time with geometry, because space-time is geometry. And so when you get into deeper levels of some stuff going on today in physics, etc., talking about engineering space-time through geometry, through shape, because it is itself geometry. But I want you to take that concept we just saw where they showed this. Space-time is commonly showed in physics texts as a type of a flexible net, a malleable net that gets distorted and that creates all existence inside of it. It's literally the blueprint of creation that everything gets formed in. And we find that same concept pre-existing modern physics by thousands of years. In the Jewish Kabbalah, we see the form of a net being formed by the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet arrayed around the outside of a sphere, and their interconnections make the grid, the matrix of all of creation. And the same thing for the Greeks. They use this hexagonal form to show that matrix of the net. So let's start with ancient Egypt, which is where the Jewish and Greek traditions came out of. Ancient Egypt actually had a tradition called the Masters of the Net. And these two pictures are from a great work by the great Egyptologist Schwaller de Lubitz in his masterwork called The Temple of Man. And what it shows here is that Thoth, better known to the Egyptians as Tehauti or Jehoti, is shown stretching the cord. And the title that goes with this is Thoth, Master of the Net at Karnak. And this idea of the stretching of the cord, in my analysis of it, my understanding of it, is that when you first hold the cord, you're holding it at a point. It's zero-dimensional. When you then stretch the cord, you are creating sacred space. Spirit is moving into the first dimension of space, into matter. And so this ritual that's shown time and time again in ancient Egypt of the stretching of the cord is the consciousness of spirit moving into matter with the first axis, the first dimension of space, and then the other axes come in. And this one shows you the background grid behind it. Egyptologists are very aware that many of these forms that we see on the Egyptian temple walls, etc., actually were based on a background grid the Egyptians used, where they would literally create this matrix or this net to pattern what they were going to put on the temple walls. Also remember that what's on the temple walls in Egypt was not seen by the public. The public in ancient Egypt were not allowed into the temples. It was only for the initiates. This particular illustration from an Egyptian temple wall has hieroglyphs accompanying it that basically say that these initiates are being taught how to catch and cast magic in their nets. As I've described to some of you before, this idea of them catching and casting magic in the nets is related, I think, to this idea of Arthur C. Clarke's, where he says that any sufficiently advanced form of technology that you don't understand will appear to you to be magic. But it's not necessarily magic to them. They had different words in Egypt for it. They understood that these nets are representing this matrix of space-time, this matrix of sacred geometry, that they're being taught how to master. And so in ancient Egypt, you find these direct references to the initiation of the masters of the net, and direct references to the net of creation. If you look in chapter 153 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, they go through every part of the net, and the person after death to not get caught in the net, has to identify every part of it. So this is a major part of the Egyptian initiation. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into a little bit of detail on the different masters of the net lineages in the West, starting with Egypt. This is from the textbook of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and their meanings. And what they show here is that the Egyptians had multiple names in hieroglyphs. It says this is the hieroglyph for the name of a part of the magical net. This is a hieroglyph for a different part of the magical net. This is the name of two different parts, not these two parts, but two other parts of the net of specific spiritual beings. So they have all of these specific references to the net and its functions. But the thing is that modern Egyptologists only know that they refer to the net. They don't understand the specific functions. And because of this, it's very important if you read any ancient Egyptian text that you get a text that actually shows you the pictures of the original hieroglyphic text, because otherwise you're going to get somebody's interpretation. And there have been books published that will compare 5 different translations of old Egyptian texts, and they're like they came from totally different books. They're so wide-ranging in their interpretation, you're going to miss the main points. Now here's another interesting thing, which is that the old Egyptian ruler has divisions on it that have different spiritual concepts for every division. The point in the center of the circle is the first one. The feather of Ma'at, which is truth, and connecting to spirit through truth is the next one. So whenever they measured something in physical space, they also were reminded of the spiritual quality behind the creation of the world in the first place. So we talked about the importance in many different traditions of understanding the local context for Earth, because it's our local spiritual context too. The energies that we have moving through our energy body and through our consciousness are coming from our local context of the planets and the constellations. Spiritual movement from the Earth outward is going to pass through the planetary spheres and the constellations. So same thing in Egypt. Here is the very famous zodiac of Dendara, which shows the signs of the zodiac in a beautiful spiral pattern. And these are then represented in the work of Schwaller de Lubitz, where he shows the link between the modern forms of these signs of the zodiac and the ways they were represented directly in ancient Egypt. And we can see clear foundations for the modern representations of the signs of the zodiac in the ancient Egyptian temples. So here we see them again, but what's shown here is that there are specific beings called netters to the Egyptians, representing Venus, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, etc. And for those of you that took the biogeometry course, we talked a little bit there about the concept of netter, because if you read an English translation of the Egyptian text, they will always translate the word netter as being a god or a goddess. But the term netter is actually the foundation of the modern English term nature. So a netter is actually a principle of nature. It's a force of nature, but it's a conscious force of nature. What for us is a dichotomy between a conscious being and a force of nature did not exist for the Egyptians. Everything in the world is conscious. Everything can be interacted with. It's the classic shamanic understanding of the world that all traditional peoples have. And so what they understood is that there were specific forces, beings connected to the planets that they could connect with, and they had an archetypal nature to them. Now this concept of netter is important, because understanding what they meant by netter and how that's different from the way we think of God or goddess, it's a force of nature that is conscious, leads to an understanding also of some things that happen in later Western esotericism, where once again we find that in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, the names of the higher spiritual beings are a description of their function. They are forces of nature. Mikael, Raphael, Gabriel, Uriel. These are conscious spiritual beings that we can interact with, but they are also forces of nature that have a specific function. And that then leads to the question of how do you communicate to the netters? And I have seen the Egyptians that I've worked with do amazing things, and they never do this stuff publicly. But privately I've seen them do incredible things. And when they do it, working with natural forces, they say, I simply talked to the netters and I requested it. And there's a particular way of talking to the netters. You have to use their language. It's not necessarily the English language, but part of the sacred geometric language is their language to connect to them. So again, there's something behind this that's very important, understanding that all the forces of nature are conscious and can be interacted with, and we need to know their language to be able to communicate. What we see here is another form of creating a sacred space when you lay the foundation of a temple. It's a stretching of the cord ceremony, and often represented as the leader of the project, sometimes the pharaoh, holding one stick and pulling the cord from one side to create the sacred space. And on the other side was a particular netter known as Seshat. And Seshat, very interestingly, is shown in connection to a particular quality of number. And in the vast majority of cases, she's shown having the 7-pointed form on the top of her head. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow with the energy science of sacred geometry is the idea we deal with in biogeometry of the quality of number. Numbers have functions. Numbers have energy qualities. In biogeometry, we talked about the way that the quality of the number 7, by having 7 repetitions of something, you can create a negative green carrier wave. It actually is a form to send energy. Later tomorrow, we'll look at other qualities of the number 7, including 7 as a quality of time. But these numbers have functions connected to them, and it shows very clearly that the function of this netter is connected also to the function of the 7. And I'll just give you one other side comment here for some of you that have done research in particular areas, and that is there have been scientific topological studies that look at what happens to a 4th dimensional circle when you flatten a 4th dimensional circle into a circle in the physical world. And they find that topologically, that higher dimensional circle flattened down to a 2-dimensional circle has to have 7 cuts in it. It has 7 divisions. When you move this higher dimensional form down to the circle in 2 dimensions, it has 7 divisions in it. So here's more representations of Seshat with her headdress, really emphasizing this. And here's an interesting thing. She's known as Seshat the Great, Lady of the Archives, Lady of Writings. And also she's shown represented with a form of the hieroglyph that was the hieroglyph for a plan or a foundation to create a sacred space. She's always shown involved with the creation of a sacred space. Quality of the number 7. The function, the netter function of that. And this is the hieroglyph for the plan or foundation. And then later when we get into form drawing, Elizabeth is going to explore you're actually drawing out this hieroglyph, because there's a quite remarkable energy movement pattern involved there. So when we explore the idea of the master builders of ancient Egypt, we come to the concept of the forerunners of what will later come as the European Masonic tradition. And that's where we're going to pick it up when we come back from lunch. It's time for lunch right now. Jane, do you know if Elizabeth's gone to check on lunch? Is the fellow here?
She's gone.
Okay, will you just check quickly? Because if he's not here yet, I'll keep going. But he wanted us to end right at 12:30 so we still get the food hot. So I'll tell you a little more about the Masons until we find out for sure the guy's here. So what this is from a wonderful book by Alexander Badaway. This book is very, very hard to find, and when you can find it, it usually costs $150, $200. It's very hard to find. It's a book on the analysis of harmonic design in ancient Egypt. And we actually make it available through Vesica. We make copies of it and we make it available. We have a couple of copies here. I found out about this book through a videotape, actually, by John Anthony West, who is a fellow who does a lot of Egyptological studies, and he particularly works with the work of Schwaller de Lubitz. But West was saying that this was one of the great academic studies that validated the esoteric concepts of de Lubitz and showed the sacred designs of ancient Egypt beyond the level that other academics were willing to do. This is actually an academic study done by a fellow from University of Southern California. And so one of the things in this book is this analysis where he finds the particular Masonic insignia, these emblems, that the different master builders in ancient Egypt left behind from this particular site and from the time of Akhenaten at Amarna. And he then compares them to the later Byzantine and Gothic masons' marks. Because as we're going to see later, the masons would use particular geometric templates, some of which you'll be creating yourself later in this course. And the geometric templates that they were taught in a secret initiation to become literal builders. I'm not talking about modern masons. I'm talking about the original masons that built the cathedrals of Europe. 5 minutes? Is that correct?
4 on the tape.
Okay, that should be right then. So they would be taught, these original masons that are known as operative masons, they're operative masons because they actually build things, that they would use these particular blueprint patterns, these matrices, these net patterns, as part of their basic training. Again, connected to the stuff that you're going to do starting today with Jane in this course. And once they were taught these patterns, the average person wouldn't know them. So every one of the masons would choose their own insignia by making an outline, making a form on some of these basic blueprint patterns that would fit on the blueprint. So that in those days, there was no central registry. If you'd actually been initiated by the masons or not to know how to build the temples, there was no place you could call up and say, hey, did Joe actually train as a mason? Instead, you would have an insignia. And the true masons could recognize if your form actually fit on one of the blueprints or not. And that's what you see right here. These forms being related to the blueprints they would learn to know how to create the temples, how to create the cathedrals of Europe, etc. And these being the basic forms created by the Egyptian masons that ran before them. This is very interesting because if you look at Masonic lore, they always say that we go back to ancient Egypt. We got our knowledge and how to do this from ancient Egypt. And then they connect to the Temple of Solomon. So in the building of these temples and the building of these structures, we see that there's a particular link here. So you'll see these statues like this, where the form of the pharaoh is striding forward. It's a position of power, and he's moving forward. And so there's a particular position of the body. And then in the work of Delubich, he showed that actually that positioning is then modeled on the actual form of things like the Temple of Luxor, the Temple of Karnak, and other temples in ancient Egypt, particularly Luxor in his studies. And so if you look at the form of the temple, it has this straight structure coming straight down, but then it angles at the bottom. And he says this is the same form of the human being in motion put into the form of the temple. And then he goes into tremendous analysis of all the parts of the Temple of Luxor and shows how it's connected to the actual energetic blueprint of a human being being replicated in the temple. And this wasn't just the Egyptians, the Indians did the same thing. They would create the form of the temple being based on the energy analysis of the human being. So that at the upper part of one of the temples you might have this particular structure. And Delubich would show how that structure then correlates to one of the other forms you could find at the same temple where they showed you the outline of a human head. And one imprints on the other. So the actual positions of the rooms would correlate to certain functions of energy centers in the human being. And it would actually be used for a function related to that energy function of the human being, related to things like the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, other spiritual functions of the human being, then being enacted in that space in the temple. So where we left off, we were going through a bit of background on the initiation in the Western tradition into sacred geometry and the masters of the net. And so looking at the Egyptian tradition, we come to the way that in the Egyptian tradition there is a highly advanced form of directly applicable mathematics and geometry, directly connected to their design concepts. I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. One is that most people are familiar with this Eye of Horus type of design. And one of the things that's not as generally known is that the actual hieroglyphs that represent certain fractions in the Old Egyptian actually make up parts of the Old Egyptian Eye of Horus hieroglyph. And they're actually all fractions of 64, which is interesting if you have a background with the I Ching and with basic binary numbers. So where you have the yin and the yang, and you have two possibilities, and then you go through a particular progression to where in the I Ching, with the hexagrams, there are 64 different hexagrams. So that actual fractions and their forms in ancient Egyptian actually are related to particular numerals that then make up the actual form itself. So again, the form itself is a composite of the hieroglyphs for the numerical fractions. Now, one interesting part of this that sometimes is brought out is that certain parts of this, basically the pupil of the eye and these underlined forms, that in the Egyptology text, they usually compare this to the actual forms you see underneath the eye of a hawk. They have particular designs on their body underneath the eye of a hawk. That these particular forms, if you look at the fractions connected to them, that they actually, from one perspective, they are fractions related to 64. But from another perspective, if you use the 1 over 64 as a base, then the 1 over 32 gives you a value of 2, if 1 over 64 is 1, and 1 over 4 is 16. Interestingly enough then, this particular hieroglyphic set gives you the equivalent number of 19. And that might be interesting for those of you who remember in the biogeometry course, we discussed the way that the quality of the number 19 is to create an emanation of these three energy balancing qualities that in biogeometry is called the BG3. And we mentioned in the biogeometry course that we use the number 16 repetitions of a design element, or 16 in proportions, like the golden proportion, to create these BG3 energies in Egyptian design. And the 19 creates a more powerful emanation of these energies and is reserved for sacred sites. We also mentioned in the biogeometry course, if you recall, for those of you that were present, that the number 19 is a sacred number that it's hard to get a lot of information on in most spiritual traditions, but one tradition that really specializes in it is the Islamic tradition. And the number 19 is considered to be a very holy number that's connected to the Bismillah, which is a mantric phrase that's a summary of the meaning of the Quran. And the number 19 appears as a sacred number multiple times in Islamic esotericism. And one reason for that is that the Islamic esotericism is coming out of the culture area that before that had the Egyptian mysteries. So that knowledge then gets brought into the later time. But the basic idea here is that certain forms that you might be familiar with seeing in the Egyptian mysteries actually have behind them this mathematical and geometrical reference. So it's part of a larger system. And to give you another example of that, if you see this type of form, like here's Ramses the Ninth, and in this particular hieroglyphic set, it shows him with the serpent behind him, and he stretches beyond the serpent. But what it's actually connected to is it's a representation of the 3, 4, 5 Pythagorean triangle that we'll be dealing with later in the course that was fundamental in sacred design in Egypt and elsewhere. And also particular harmonics related to the phi ratio. So that what you don't see brought out in this is that encoded in it is particular knowledge of geometry and numerical constants that are hidden inside the form. Now what this shows is that out of cuneiform comes the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and out of that then come Phoenician, which then gives rise to Greek and the Old Hebrew, and then to Aramaic, and then the post-Aramaic scripts that include Arabic. So essentially from the roots in the Egyptian time, if we trace the language, it then gives rise to the Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, etc. And that's going to be important for us because where we're going to go next is looking at the way that the Egyptian mystery knowledge and mystery culture, at the time that the Egyptian high culture began to decline, the time of the Greeks and the Romans coming in and the Roman conquest, you then had some of the knowledge from the Egyptian temples moving into Greece and Israel. And there's an interesting statement from the Rosicrucian teacher Rudolf Steiner, where he says that what went from Egypt into Greece were the mysteries of space, and what went from Egypt into Israel were the mysteries of time. And so you find the Greeks then preserve knowledge of things like the Platonic solids, the perfect three-dimensional geometries, which you don't see as prominent in the Hebrew tradition. But the Hebrew texts are full of references to time cycles. And so a lot of knowledge coming out from the Egyptian tradition. So let's look at the Hebrew tradition first. Many of you are familiar with the form of the tree of life. And you might find that in different texts, they will give you slightly different forms of the tree of life as a literal glyph of a background pattern of creation. It's related both to multiple worlds of manifestation and their linkage, and also a background blueprint for the human energy body itself. Now the thing is that there are different patterns here, and within the deeper levels of the Jewish Kabbalah, there are descriptions of the way that one is the actual tree of life of emanation, and the other is the tree of return. And so there's a difference here that both of them actually have 22 paths connecting the 10 spheres on the tree of life. But the one on the tree of emanation does not connect to what's sometimes referred to as the 11th or the hidden sephira or sphere, the one of Da'ath. And instead there are lines connecting here and here. Whereas on the tree of return, in this form of the glyph, you then have lines connecting to this hidden sephira here, and you don't have the lines connecting here. There's very deep knowledge related to this construction glyph. This is a geometric pattern of creation that appears in multiple places, and that we tend to associate with the Hebrew mysteries, but in texts like the work of Enel. Enel was a writer who wrote a series of texts in the first part of the last century connecting the Jewish Kabbalah with the Egyptian mysteries. And he showed at that time that there is a direct connection between the spheres or the points of the tree of life and teachings within the Egyptian temples themselves, with particular triads of netters and then triads of centers on the tree of life. So again, much of this knowledge is coming from Egypt. It takes a slightly different form, but there's very clear connections from the Egyptian mysteries into the beginning of the Hebrew mysteries in the Old Testament, with a description of the way that Moses was initiated in the Egyptian temples and learned their skills. As a background pattern, there are particular matrices or nets that are hidden within the Jewish Kabbalah, that within those nets you can actually construct patterns like the tree of life or the form of the menorah. So these are the background grids. This is actually from a very interesting work by a woman named Leonora Leet, and the book is called The Secret Doctrine of the Kabbalah. And what I find very interesting about this book, The Secret Doctrine of the Kabbalah by Leonora Leet, is that with these fascinating sacred geometric mysteries of the Kabbalah that she's revealing, she actually had studied both with a great Kabbalist named Arya Kaplan, who wrote some fantastic works on the Jewish Kabbalah, and she'd also studied sacred geometry with Robert Lawler, who has written one of the most prominent books on sacred geometry. So she had studied both Kabbalistic and sacred geometric mysteries. And in her book, Secret Doctrine of the Kabbalah, she goes into really fascinating things that had not really been made public before about the geometric mysteries encoded in the Kabbalah. And what tickles me about it is that in classical, very strict Kabbalah, it's only taught to married men above the age of 40 or 42, depending on the group and the time. And classically, it was never taught to women. You might remember there was a movie with Barbra Streisand called A Yentl, where she has to dress up like a man so she will be taught in the yeshiva these Kabbalistic mysteries, because they wouldn't teach a woman. So the interesting thing is that many of these Kabbalistic rabbis that would not teach Leonora Leet actually didn't know the things that she revealed in her text. They had to learn it from her, which I think is kind of ironic and amusing. So we showed this in the outset here, a very interesting pattern that's known as the 231 gates of the Kabbalah, where you have the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and every one of the letters is a nodal point of energy on the perimeter of a circle or a sphere, and every one connects to every other one, creating this harmonious matrix of energy pattern within the sphere of creation. One of the great mysteries of the Kabbalah that we're going to talk about in more detail tomorrow, because it directly relates to the construction of the human energy bodies and the coding system of the human energy bodies is the information in a text called the Sefer Yetzirah. The Sefer Yetzirah means literally the book of formation. Yetzirah is one of the four worlds of emanation of the Kabbalah, from the high Godhead up all the way down to the level of the manifest world. And in the Sefer Yetzirah, it makes very clear that the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet divide into three groups. It says there are 3 mother letters, Aleph, Mem, and Shin. There are 7 double letters, and there are 12 elemental letters. So there's a particular coding sequence here of sacred numbers 3, 7, and 12 that we'll see tomorrow are actually the coding system behind the human subtle bodies. But interestingly enough, in the Jewish Kabbalah, the 3, 7, and 12 numbers and what they relate to, that again we'll look at tomorrow, is so important that they've also been encoded into the form of the Tree of Life. Now the Tree of Life has 10 different spheres of different qualities, and all those spheres are connected up with pathways. And there are 22 pathways exactly that connect up the 10 spheres. Every one of those pathways is then connected to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet in classical esotericism. But one of the interesting things about it is that the 3, 7, 12, if you didn't read the Sefer Yetzirah and you didn't understand that the 22 letters divide into 3, 7, and 12, because there's something very important about the 3, 7, 12 coding pattern, you could pick it up if all that had remained to you was the form of the Tree of Life. Because the form of the Tree of Life has 3 horizontal paths, 7 vertical paths, and 12 diagonal paths. So again, in its form, it has encoded the same information: 3, 7, and 12. 3 horizontal, 7 vertical, and 12 diagonal. Now another thing about this is that sometimes the 10 spheres on the Tree of Life with the 22 paths are referred to as the 32 paths of the Tree of Life. The 10 spheres plus the 22 paths, sometimes referred to as the 32 paths. Now the significance of that is that Aryeh Kaplan, again this great Jewish Kabbalist who had taught Leonora Leet and wrote some fantastic books on the Kabbalah, particularly has a great book on the Sefer Yetzirah. He says in his book on the Sefer Yetzirah, his Kabbalistic commentary, he says if you take a look at the pattern on higher dimensional forms, if you look at the form of a cube has 8 corners or vertices, and then the form of a hypercube has double that. It has 16 corners or vertices on a 4th dimensional cube that we can only show the shadows of in 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional space. But that means that you double it again to get a 5th dimensional hypercube. And so a 5th dimensional hypercube has 32 corners or vertices. And Aryeh Kaplan in his work then connects the 32 corners or vertices on a 5th dimensional cube to the 32 paths on the Tree of Life. And this is a projection 2-dimensionally of a 5th dimensional hypercube. And in fact, right down here, we'll get into this in more detail later, but this is actually a 3-dimensional projection of a 5th dimensional hypercube. So we'll look at that in more detail later on. But it's interesting that here you have one of the leading Kabbalistic scholars of his time saying that the form of the Tree of Life is actually connected to this higher dimensional cube form. And we also then have models of this Tree of Life that are 3-dimensional in nature instead of just a flat glyph. Groups like the Golden Dawn in Britain would work with a 3-dimensional form of the Tree of Life. And then particular authors then developed the idea that the Tree of Life itself was a constantly expanding and connecting form, with one world connecting to the next, so that from a central matrix it extends out in all directions 3-dimensionally, so that the Tree of Life itself actually creates a matrix of energy where it self-replicates time and time again at multiple scales of creation. And a very important aspect of the Tree of Life that I mentioned before is the idea that the Tree of Life actually exists within the human energy field itself. That There are groups that I know of that some are Jewish Kabbalistic and some are actually Greek esoteric Christian that work with the form of the tree of life in the energy field, with the idea being that the tree of life is literally that. It is the geometric blueprint or template for the human energy bodies to form around, so that in working with this, they can actually develop a form that is connected to doing work out of the body in higher worlds and to being able to actually manifest a physical form out of the ethers. It's related to some very deep levels of the Kabbalah, and again, there are both Greek Christians and Jewish Kabbalists that work with this mystery of the tree of life in the energy field. Some of you know my friend Joey Korn, who is a Jewish Kabbalistic dowser, who has done a lot of work in recent years in learning how to dowse the tree of life in any person's energy field. And when he finds particular problems in a particular center in the field or in a particular pathway, he can identify certain things that are going on physiologically or emotionally, psychologically with the person that's leading to distortions in the person's tree of life pattern. So it's a very fascinating field of study. Again, some of the deeper knowledge of it in the classical traditions is fairly hidden because they considered it one of their secrets. The tree of life is something you work with practically. This is also related to some of the Jewish Kabbalistic work in which the centers can be activated in a particular pattern that's sometimes referred to as a serpent's path or as a lightning strike, where the lightning comes and it activates the first center and then moves in a particular sequence to activate them in a series. The beginning of the book of Genesis is normally translated as in the beginning. The actual Hebrew terms for it are Bereshit. Bereshit is the beginning of the very beginning of the Old Testament, the beginning of the book of Genesis. Now, Bereshit can actually be translated different ways depending on how you break up the letters, because in the original text of the Old Testament, there aren't periods at the end of a sentence. You have to figure out at what letter to break it up into a word. So there's a lot of interpretation involved. So one way you can read it is Bereshit means in the beginning. But there's a Kabbalistic interpretation which is also accurate according to the original Hebrew, which says that the terms Bereshit actually stand for He created six. So instead of in the beginning, being the beginning of Genesis, He created six comes at the beginning. Why would it say He created six? And so then in Leonora Leitz and other Kabbalistic works, they look at this meaning of He created six, that six is the archetypal pattern that you just explored. Around the central circle, you can perfectly get six other circles around it, creating this form of the flower pattern. And that then gives you the template for the hexagon and the hexagram, which is itself the emblem of Judaism. So the six-pointed star itself is actually indicated from the very beginning of the very first part of the text of Genesis. So once you get into the deeper levels of the Kabbalah, you find that in fact there are multiple references to sacred geometry. And here it's actually describing the sacred geometry of creation with the harmonic of 7, which is very important, and also with the way that you can perfectly nest 6 equally sized circles or spheres around a central one, which is a topic we'll be pursuing in more depth later on. One of the classical mysteries of the Jewish Kabbalah has to do with the name of God, which is sometimes referred to as tetragrammaton, simply meaning the 4-letter word. And it essentially is Yod He Vav He. And so it has a form in English often of being given as Jehovah, or in some renderings of it from the original language is something closer to Yahweh. There are some indications from the Kabbalistic text that the true pronunciation of it actually is all vowel sounds. And so one of the aspects of the Yod He Vav He mystery is related to the idea that every one of the Hebrew letters actually in its geometry holds embedded information. And the Hebrew letters are referred to as flame letters. And they're perceived spiritually as literal letters of flame holding a particular geometric form. And so one of the Kabbalistic mysteries related to it is that this Kabbalistic name of God, Yod He Vav He, is also the structure for creating a human being. so that the yod becomes the head at the top. The he becomes the shoulders and the arms and the trunk. And then the center of the body becomes the vow, and then the last he becomes the base of the body and the legs. So it literally becomes a glyph for the outline of the body. Another one of the major mysteries in the Jewish Kabbalah, which is also true for the Greeks, is a mystery known as gematria. Gematria has to do with the way that in sacred languages, including Hebrew, Greek, Sanskrit, Arabic, etc., there is a system of one-to-one correlation between the letters of the alphabet and a particular number. Now, this has particular consequences. What it means is that you can hide a name by giving a number, and that number will translate into a name. Or you can give a name that will translate into a number. Or you can give either a number or a name that will then translate into the length that you put into something like a building or a temple. So this whole mystery of how letters and numbers intertwine is this mystery of gematria. And some of the encoded information that you find in the Old and New Testament can only be understood through understanding gematria and how to convert letters to numbers and vice versa. One of the best known examples of this, and one that is unfortunately not better known amongst conventional Christian circles, is the mystery of the 666. And in the book of Revelation, it says, "Let he who hath understanding reckon the number of the beast, because it is the number of a man, and it is the number 666. Now, in some text, they will solve this according to modern academics, where they say that 666 is actually the rendering in gematria of the name Nero, Nero Caesar. And it was actually, from that perspective, supposed to be a commentary on the fact that the Jews at that time didn't like the Romans who had occupied their country. But in fact, that is a false solution to the mystery of the 666. That is not the accurate solution. The accurate solution is well known to Jewish and Greek Kabbalists, which is that there is a classical system in which there are magical squares. A magical square is a square that has sets of different numbers running from one number up to another number in the series. None of the numbers is ever repeated, but the numbers are placed in different locations, blocks within the overall square, so that you get the same number no matter what direction you add it up. Side to side, top to bottom, etc., all adds up to the same number. And the system of magic squares has been known to most traditions around the world. There's clear indications of it in the Indian tradition, as well as the Greek, Hebrew, etc. Now, the significance of this is that some of these magical squares were understood in classical times to connect directly to forces of the planets, and they had a system. They understood that the netters behind the planets, the spiritual forces that are conscious, the spiritual beings that are behind the forces of the planets, had particular vibrations to them. And those vibrations are a combination of particular sounds. And those sounds can be reduced to particular numerals that are connected to those sounds or letters in gematria. And so in their system, the positive netter, the positive being behind a particular planet, would be called the intelligence. So this is the square of the sun, also known as the kamea of soul, which means the square of the sun. And so the intelligence, or the beneficial being of that planet, has a name Nachael. And to get this glyph, and often you won't get any of this information, you'll just see a glyph in some type of magical text from the Kabbalist that says that this is the glyph for Nachael. It's related to this particular system here, in which on the overall square, you would then find the name, the letters correlating to the name Nachael, N-K-I-A-L. They're related to particular numbers, and they add up to a particular number set. And you would then find n equals 50, it reduces to 5. Okay, I've got to 5 there. Then I pattern there's 20, okay, there's 10, etc. And what you do is you then connect the locations on the square, and that gives you the form of the glyph that is connected, the sigil, connected to that particular being. And so if you understand the mystery of gematria and of the magic square, then you'll understand where these geometric glyphs come from that you find in the magical text. Along the same lines, the detrimental being the opposing being, the hindering being, the evil being, that's connected to a planetary force, and there's one for all of the classical planets, is called the spirit in this case. Now, of course, spirit doesn't always refer to something negative, but in this system, intelligence was the term they used for the beneficial, and spirit for the detrimental spiritual forces of a particular planet. And so this particular name and this glyph actually is the solving of the riddle of the 666. If you were to break this name down into its component gematria letters and then pattern it out on the magic square, this is what you would get. That's the true solution of the 666. It has to do with the counter force of the sun, this opposing force of the sun, the force that is against the good solar powers, that is against the solar logos. This will later, in post-Christian times, be referred to as connected to the force of Antichrist, this opposing force of the sun, which is why it appears in the book of Revelation the way that it does. And this just shows you here that all of the classical planets are related to a particular square. And for the square of Saturn, then there are 9 component squares in the overall square. For Jupiter, it's 16, etc. And it builds up through the different planetary forces. And then showing you here that we had just looked at Nakael, and there are various glyphs related to those different planetary forces. So once you have this as a background, you can start to understand some of the things in the sacred texts and understand some of the sigils that they use in their Kabbalistic manuscripts. These are various sigils related to the forces of the planets and to the archangels, Raphael, Gabriel, Samael, Michael, etc. Next. And that then brings us to the use of amulets and medallions for spiritual connection and spiritual protection. The system of using amulets, something that you wear that has specific geometric shapes to it, and often particular words or letters from a sacred alphabet with particular meanings on it, is one that is common throughout the ancient world. You find it in both the East and the West. So here's one example from ancient Israel, have the 6-pointed star and 2 circles and various names in Hebrew. And this one here is composed primarily of glyphs. There's particular glyphs that are related to that knowledge in the Kabbalah that I talked about before. These are referred to as secret scripts. Every one of them is connected to a particular energy, every one of these shapes, and has a meaning of a particular spiritual being in most cases. Now when you understand that, you can begin to understand other things too, such as in the medieval painting called Virgin and Child. If you look at the sleeve of the Madonna, it has particular patterns, and this is a close-up of it. So that on the actual medieval painting, that they don't explain to you, they actually show some of these patterns. And these patterns are part of the old Jewish Kabbalistic secret scripts, being handed down in this case through the art, as well as in many cases through architecture and things of that kind. So that's just a quick overview of some of the knowledge of the masters of the net tradition in ancient Israel and with the Jewish Kabbalist. Now let's take a look at what part of this came into Greece. The masters of the net in Greece was a very prominent part of the Greek mysteries. As we mentioned a moment ago, from a Rosicrucian perspective, it was the mysteries of time that went to the Jewish Kabbalah, although some of space as well, as we just showed you. But as far as the public release of the shapes, it really went to the Greeks, the knowledge of space. There was actually an old Greek text that was called literally the net. And the form that accompanied that text was this form here. And again, it shows you this matrix form, again within a hexagon. Remember the form that we just saw from the Kabbalah, which is this Genesis form of the 6 around the 1 creating the flower pattern, and which also creates the hexagon, which also contains the Star of David. So in this case, the Greeks taught this hexagon form. And one of the things that's embedded in this Greek form of the net is that it actually is the form of a cube seen from one corner forward. So if we look at a form of a cube right here, and it's tilted in such a way that you have a corner of the cube pointing toward you, what it gives you is a 6-sided hexagonal outline. And that's what you see here. So encoded in this form of the Greek net, if you look at where I'm pointing to right here as the outer corner of the cube pointing forward, then this defines two lines, and this is a face, and here's another two lines, and here's another face, and there's the other two lines, and there's the face. So embedded within this two-dimensional projection, with the information of the net, the matrix, the blueprint of creation, is also the information that this is the matrix within the cube. This is the matrix within this black cube, like the Kaaba that we described before, because our world is the cube. We live in the box, the cube of the three-dimensional world. Now this form of the net also appears elsewhere in ancient Greece. I got this picture here of the foundation stone, the omphalos stone, at the great oracle site of Delphi in Greece from a particular text. And in the book where it had this illustration, it said that no one today understands what the meaning is of this strange pattern on the foundation stone of Delphi. Well, if they looked into it a little more deeply, they would have known what it was. It was a part of this net matrix pattern. And we not only see it on the foundation stone at Delphi, but if you take a look at this old Greek coin, it shows the foundation stone of Delphi with this net matrix on it. And sitting on top of it is Apollo. Now Apollo is the representation of the spiritual force of the sun, which will come in the development of the Greek mysteries later in the New Testament for the Solar Logos and the Christos. Now there's something else embedded here too. When you have the sun sitting on top of the foundation stone creating this matrix. And we're going to be getting to this later in the course as part of the energy science and part of the earth grid information we'll be dealing with at the end of the course. But what we're going to find out then is that modern bodies of work, there's one body of work from Australia by a man named Bruce Cathy that shows that the sun's position vis-a-vis the earth grid creates particular energy patterns on the earth. And we can also remember this in terms of what we learned for those of you that took the biogeometry course, where we found that the French researchers found that on the surface of a three-dimensional sphere, the energy patterns of the different energy qualities kept moving over the surface of the sphere following the progression of the sun's placement vis-a-vis the sphere, whether it's a planet or a sphere you hold in your hands. So also with the French, they found that the actual energetics on the planet Earth or on forms you hold in your hand are affected by the actual geometric angle of the sun to the earth or to the object. Now the Greeks are the ones that we actually owe a lot of our basic esoteric knowledge in the West today to, so that our knowledge of Atlantis comes directly from the Greeks. It's from the writings of Plato. It's in Plato's writing that he says that Solon learned from the Egyptian priest that the period of time before our current civilization was referred to as Atlantis. And this wasn't like some wild theory to them, this was just simply straightforward history. So our knowledge of the Atlantis period that preceded ours and of the Great Flood, which is actually testified to by archaeological and literary evidence all over the planet, actually comes today from the Greeks, including the term Atlantis itself. Now also with the Greeks, we have the particular leader of their mystery culture being called Thoth Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great Hermes. And it is a reappearance of Thoth, or Jehute, from the Egyptian tradition, now brought into the Greek tradition. So Hermes is directly called Thoth Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, as another appearance of the leader of the Egyptian culture, now brought into Greece itself. And the Greeks also worked with the form of the tree of life, and in fact there was a lot of interchange between the Jewish and Greek cultures, which is very clear if you study the New Testament history and the way that there's this interchange between the Hebrew and the Greek culture, including the writing of the New Testament in the Greek language. Although there is evidence that for some of the books of the New Testament, they were actually originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew. But those earlier versions have been lost, and it's the Greek that remain. But this Greek version of the tree of life was then connected as a glyph to give us the different planets in the solar system, and was actually one of these traveling glyphs to be able to make that journey through the heavenly halls, through the planetary spheres, by moving on the tree of life. Now this is a modern Greek Christian Hermetic tree of life. And some of you that have done work with me in the past, like came to the summer course, for example, we talked quite a bit then about this particular body of work. This comes from a Greek Christian Hermetic teacher and healer who was only revealed to the public in the late 1980s. And there were a series of books written about him. The first was called The Magus of Stravolos. And then there's another called Homage to the Sun, and one called Fire in the Heart. And they talked about this Greek Christian teacher who they called Daskalos, because Daskalos is the Greek word for teacher. And they didn't give you his true name. Everyone's names in those books actually are pseudonyms. The actual name of this person they referred to as Daskalos, or teacher, was Stylianos Ateshlis. He lived on the island of Cyprus and was just a really amazing Greek Christian Hermetic healer and master. And he wrote a number of books about his esoteric system. And in one of them, called The Symbol of Life, he gives this particular pattern. And he says that there is a Greek Christian version of the Tree of Life that is different from the Jewish Kabbalistic version. He says that this version actually was developed in the school of Akhenaten in Egypt. And one of the interesting things about the work of this fellow, Stylianos Ateshlis, or Daskalos, is that he was known for being able, without ever having studied it, to be able to fluently write Old Egyptian hieroglyphs and to speak ancient Egyptian. He was also fluent in Sanskrit, although he had never studied it in this lifetime. He was a really amazing fellow. And so in this book, Symbol of Life, that's a big book you have to order directly from Cyprus, they tell you about this whole story of the development of the Greek Christian Hermetic Tree of Life in the school of Akhenaten. And you see here this triangular form connected to the school of Akhenaten that is then superimposed above the place of the head. And that all these other positions come in for them working with the Tree of Life. And every part of the Tree of Life is also connected to particular geometric forms, and even has multiple layers to it, dealing with different layers of the body, whether it's the etheric energy level, or the astral level, or the spiritual level.
What is their website again, Ron?
Their website is, yes, researchers-of-truth.org is their website in Cyprus. And I highly recommend the works by Stylianos Ateshlis. So the Greeks also worked with gematria, as did the Jewish Kabbalist. And there's a very direct relationship between the Greek language and the Hebrew: alpha and aleph, beta and bait, gamma and gimel, delta and dalet. Again, a very similar form of gematria. So there's very deep work in the Greek gematria having to do with their understanding of spiritual beings and forces, similar to what you find in the Jewish Kabbalah. And in fact, it's really not possible to understand some of the mysteries of the New Testament and the book of Revelation without understanding the Greek and Hebrew gematria. One part of their work was that the different letters of the Greek alphabet was understood in their mystery culture to be connected to particular forces. So one would connect to the earth, another to water, another to ether, another to fire, or it'd be connected to a particular planet of the solar system, things of that kind. So once again, they considered it to be a sacred language. Every one of those letters and their sound was connected to a divine source. Now this was also connected to the work that they did with what's known as the Platonic solids. We're not going to spend much time on it here because we're going to spend quite a bit of time on it. We're going to spend a full day on it later on in the course, and we're going to have you build these. But basically, the Greeks worked with the system of the perfect divisions of a sphere. There's only 5 perfect ways to divide a sphere so that every face of that division is exactly the same shape and size and angle as all the others. And they only taught 4 of them publicly. This was coming from the work of Pythagoras. Pythagoras trained in the Egyptian temples, and he brought that knowledge back in the Pythagorean teaching in Greece, and Plato learned from him. So we call them the Platonic solids, because even though they existed before Plato and before the Greeks, in fact, there's evidence of these exact same forms from the area of the world that is the present-day Scotland, from thousands of years before this Greek work. So they've been around for a long time. The ancient Egyptians also had these forms. But they made them public. And out of the 5 forms, they made these 4 public. There was a 5th form they did not make public, and we will discuss that tomorrow. But they really talked about these forms and how they connected to the various elements. So one of the forms, one of the 5 perfect forms, is the form of the cube. We've looked at the cube already. And so when you look at a cube of a particular size, it'll have a volume of a particular number of cubic units, a surface area of a particular number of units, and a surface area of each side. Those numbers will actually correlate directly to things like alpha and omega and the god Apollo. Again, this would simply break down so that the letters of alpha, omega, or the god Apollo would then add up to this number in gematria. And so this also is showing the relationship of the form of the cube is related to alpha and omega. In other words, the beginning and the end of creation with this form of the cube the way we've already described. And then the god Apollo, or the force of the sun. They actually taught a way that on the 8th point of the cube there is a radiation to the other 7 points. And with the spiritual sun being at the 8th point, that is related to the actual creation and sustaining of the three-dimensional world of the cube from the force of the sun itself and from the force of the solar logos and the spiritual forces behind it. So again, very deep levels of their spiritual mysteries connected to this knowledge of gematria and to the geometries involved. If you were to take it even further, you would find that there is an overtone series. In fact, our modern knowledge of musical harmonics in the West comes from Pythagoras. And so there's an overtone series, and there is a particular vibrational frequency that will then correlate to particular numbers in the Greek, and again, things like the god Apollo or Hermes or things of this kind. So it's all part of a unified system, in this case also with music and musical harmonics. And this can then be put together to actually give you blueprints for things like temples. So this is the form of the Parthenon, or the Temple of Athena in Athens. And according to the way that it's constructed, the actual size of the circles and the circle that contains the interior circles that encloses the entire form of the Parthenon and the other forms that enclose it, when you take that measurement, that gives you a number. And that number then gives you letters which become names like Hermes, Apollo, and finally, for the circle that encloses the entire blueprint form behind the Parthenon, it gives you the net. Bring us back to the masters of the net. So to understand some of the sacred architecture in these cultures also demands that we understand sacred measurements and the gematria. Now this brings us to the New Testament times, because it's out of this matrix of the Hebrew and Greek mysteries that the New Testament comes about. Now, one of the direct connections here to the masters of the net are direct references to the net in the New Testament. So there's this particular scene where Christ tells the disciples to throw their nets into the sea and to catch these fish. Now, there are scenes on the Egyptian temple walls that I have not shown you pictures of, where it shows the beings that are called the baboons of Thoth. And these are literal baboons that represent spiritual beings or forces. And they are holding nets, and they are catching human souls in the afterlife in the net represented as fish. So this is something from the Egyptian mysteries directly. When he says to cast the nets in the ocean and to catch the fish, it's a direct reference back to the same type of temple teaching of the masters of the net in ancient Egypt. And then there are direct references in the New Testament to things like the 153 fish caught in the net. Because in these Greek geometric mysteries, by which they understood the spiritual world and how it created this world, there is the way that if you have a form of a Vesica, which we'll talk about on Monday, that form of the Vesica that you get by overlapping the two circles, that the measurement on this axis is 153, and the measurement on this one is 265. So when it said there are 153 fish caught in the net, that was a cue to the people that had been trained in these mysteries to the 153 measurement within the Vesica itself. In fact, there's a great book by John Michel that's called The Dimensions of Paradise, where he takes the story of 153 fish caught in the net and he shows you the geometric blueprint that stands behind that story in the New Testament, which gives you this pattern. Now, in the old mysteries, the way I talked about earlier today, there is an understanding that our local context of energetic forces affects everything here on the planet. We started out today by talking about the first form of creation being the circle or the sphere, and then the center within that with that drafting that the Godhead does, represented by the compass. And we talked about the way that you have a relationship between the center and the periphery, with the radiation out from the center to periphery and from the periphery toward the center. That means that the zodiacal forces that surround us, if we're here in the center, these forces are constantly raying into us from the periphery to the center. And in some of the work that Elizabeth will do with you later with eurythmy, we also work with the energies that come from the peripheral forces into the center, these etheric life forces. So these forces of the zodiac surround us in the circle and radiate into the center. Now in classical times, it was understood that there is actually a great cross in the heavens, and that great cross in the heavens actually connects particular nodal points in the heavens, so that there are particular stars in Scorpio and Taurus and Aquarius and Leo that are perfectly 180 degrees apart from each other. In Scorpio and Taurus, these two particular stars of Aldebaran and Antares are 180 degrees away from each other, and they make a line or an axis in the sky. The same is true for two other stars of Regulus and Fomalhaut between Aquarius and Leo. And that creates a literal cross in the heavens that was an anchor point for these forces as studied in Babylon, Egypt, and elsewhere. Now the knowledge of those four forces then comes in to the Christian esotericism when you go to somewhere like Chartres Cathedral, other cathedrals in Europe, and you see the form of the Vesica holding the Christ within it, and he's surrounded by the four holy animals. So you have the bull and the lion and the eagle. The bull is Taurus, the lion is Leo, the eagle is the higher form of Scorpio, and then the ringed man pouring the water is Aquarius. So these representations are directly going back to the knowledge of the heavens, and then they are represented as well in the forms of the four writers of the Gospels. The winged man of Matthew, the lion of Mark, the winged ox of Luke, and the eagle of John. So once again, that actual cross in the heaven taught much earlier in history in the Babylonian star wisdom, which is the foundation for the later Holy Grail tradition of following the stars, actually comes down and is represented in the New Testament. So it's a terrible misunderstanding in certain conservative Christian sects where they throw out all types of esotericism and they say it's non-biblical, because the Bible is full of these direct references and they're there for a purpose. They're there to reconnect us to the mystery knowledge to begin with, and we cannot understand the text without the understanding of the frame of reference. And all of the symbology is significant. For example, the eagle of John. There's a reason why John is connected to the forces of Scorpio, or the eagle. Scorpio is the sign classically known as the sign of death and resurrection. It's also the sign of spiritual initiation. And by far the most esoteric of the four Gospels is the Gospel of John. It's the one that has the incredible prelude to the Gospel of John, about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This entire prelude to the Gospel of John is the main place in the New Testament that we have references to the cosmic aspect of the Christ, of the solar logos aspect, not just the Jesus aspect, but the solar logos cosmic aspect. Because John is the eagle, it is the sign of initiation, and the John Gospel is the initiation gospel. It also talks about the 7 healing miracles and the 7 I am sayings, which are an integral part of Christian initiation. Now, the eagle is also related to the actual function of the eagle, because what the eagle can do is it can soar up above the earth and see things from a distance. And so if I'm standing on a river, I can only see that one place of the river that I'm standing at this moment. But if I soar high above it and I look down, I can see the entire river as one pattern from beginning to end. And that's part of the initiation process with John, the eagle, because what he writes in the book of Revelation is rising above the stream of time and saying what will happen from the beginning to the end of time. So again, this knowledge of the eagle is directly connected to it. So all of these things are interwoven, and unfortunately today we've lost these interconnections, but we need to reclaim them. We also have the aspect of the actual name, as you might expect with the gematria, that the name of Jesus Christ itself would be significant in gematria. And so if you get Iezos and you add up the letters in the Greek gematria, you get the number 888. Now this is part of a larger matrix that I'll just show you very briefly. This is from a wonderful book called Jesus Christ, Son of God. And Son is spelled S-U-N, like the sun in the sky. Jesus Christ, Son of God, is the best guide to the Greek gematria and early Christian mysteries. So Christos is 1480, Iezos is 888, and there are actual geometric constructions with 3 circles of a trinity held inside another circle that are related to Iezos, and the square within the circle within the Vesica, whose measurements are related to the Christos. But I want to show you a particular pattern here where they actually all fit into a particular matrix. Now, this is the pattern that's shown to you in the book, Jesus Christ, Son of God. And again, it's a wonderful book, but he leaves something out. What he shows you, which is entirely accurate, is that the name Jesus Christ is actually derived from the same square of the sun that we talked about before. So that the actual value of the square of the sun, the total value of the square, is 666. But there are particular numbers on the square of the sun. Symmetrical group of 4 gives you 74. And then you get multiples of 74. So 1 times 74, 2 times 74. The base number of the square is 74, in other words. And then you keep getting multiples. So you not only get 666 as the physical aspect of the sun, in other words, the physical, not the spiritual aspect related to the force of Antichrist in later Christian mysteries, but also then when you get up to 888 and you get the spiritual sun, or the solar logos, it is also 12 times 74. And then you get up to Christos, 1480, it is 20 times 74. And so Iezos Christos is 32 times 74. 32 being also related to the 32 paths on the tree of life. Now, this is what you have in the book Jesus Christ, Son of God. What they don't give you is another very important piece to understand what stands behind the whole thing. This is all multiples of 74. But if you divide 74 in half, you come to the number 37. Well, what's the significance of that? The significance of that is in the Hebrew Kabbalah. There is a particular word in Hebrew that is the name for Keter, or the highest center on the tree of life, which in the human energy field is a point directly above the head, that is the same point that becomes a flame above the head of the disciples at Pentecost. And that particular location, which is actually a detachment of one flame from the ocean of fire that is the Godhead, that becomes the ignition of the point of energy above the human head for the reception of packed thought forms, for the direct recognition of these geometric archetypes, that center of activity is related to Keter on the tree of life and to this particular term in Hebrew, which designates that location. And in gematria, it gives you 37. So basically what it's saying is that this location on the tree of life and in the human energy field, that is the place that our spirit connects to the Godhead, is the 37 that then you get the multiples of to get Jesus Christ. It's all part of the same mystery, because the Christos, as we described earlier today, with the work coming from Origen, in the early Christian mysteries, the Christos is the Godhead reduced in scale for human beings to interact with it. And the Christos has the same essential nature as both the Godhead and the human race. So as we move forward into the later Christian mysteries, we come to a time that we find represented in art particular geometric forms. In the lighting in here, you can't hardly see it, but here in later Christian art, they see this form of a triangle around the head of God. And this form of a hexagon, or a square, or a cube around the head of, this is the Pope, and this is actually a saint. And so it's showing particular geometric blueprints around the body of energy that structure consciousness in certain ways. Because as I mentioned before, everything that is related to your feelings, your awareness, your consciousness is related to geometric energy patterns in your energy blueprint of your subtle body. And it's a very important part of initiation. So you're actually seeing that represented in the actual Christian art. Now what we have then at a later time, in around the 7th century AD, is the rise of Islam. And the story that Islam tells is of Archangel Gabriel going to Muhammad and activating Muhammad to take a certain spiritual task into the world and to found Islam. And what you find is that Islam, although all we hear about it in the West today is the worst, most fundamentalist and aggressive form of Islam, Islam actually holds within it extremely deep spiritual mysteries because it's of the same area that the old Egyptian mysteries and these other great cultures were a part of. So where's that knowledge going to go today? It goes into the deeper parts of Islamic esoteric knowledge that we never hear about in the West today, hardly ever. But Arabic also has gematria. And so again, the different letters of the Arabic alphabet relate to numbers, and they also have an advanced form of gematria. And they have these particular glyphs where they understand all the spiritual forces of the world in particular construction patterns. We're not going to go into detail on it now, but on the outer edge of this you have the different signs of the zodiac. They divide into particular columns where there are names in Arabic and particular scripts that are connected to these divine forces. And it develops to the point of becoming the 99 divine names, the 99 holy names of God in the Sufi system. Every great spiritual tradition has an esoteric branch. Every great spiritual tradition has a group within it that holds the deeper esoteric mysteries. So in Buddhism, you have the Vajrayana Buddhist. In Christianity, you have groups like the Rosicrucians. In Islam, you have groups like the Sufis. And it's within these esoteric groups that you need to look for the esoteric knowledge of that particular tradition. And what we have here is this form of the actual patterns that you will see on temple walls in Islamic architecture where they're related to particular spiritual concepts. So expansion and contraction are particular forms that come together on the wall, understood as the actual breath of the compassionate, which is the literal life breath of the Godhead moving in and out of all existence and in and out of the sacred building. And again, they also preserve this knowledge that was held by the earlier traditions. It's an integral part of Islam as well, of the movement through the planetary spheres. Again, there's a lot more that we could do with that, a lot further we could take that, but for time purposes, we're going to move forward to the next development, which is the European Holy Grail tradition. And within the Holy Grail tradition, this develops really around the 9th century. So this is after Islam. And in fact, the earliest documents of the Holy Grail tradition say that they got their mysteries from the Arabs. If you read the book Parsival, which is an initiation document for the Holy Grail tradition, in the very beginning, he says that he learned how to read the starry script, and he learned the science of the Grail from an Arab named Kiyot, and that the story of the Grail comes from that. So a lot of things are coming from these Middle Eastern sources. And in the Holy Grail tradition, the leader of the Grail stream is the Fisher King. And again, this connection with the Fisher King and the net is a very direct link. Now this brings us to the European Rosicrucian tradition. And what you see here are representations of particular geometric constructions of creation that were common in the early Rosicrucian works. The Rosicrucian material really becomes public around the early 1600s. Before that, there's a kind of murmur about some type of Christian adepts that are existing in Europe. But in the early 1600s, there are books that come forward. In one of those books, called Fama Fraternitatis, around 1604, it says that Christian Rosenkreuz is a Christian adept who was initiated in the Middle East, and then he came back to found this esoteric Christian group. And so what you find in European Rosicrucianism are these types of glyphs showing you the construction of the world in a geometric format. Here's the human being, here's the 4 elements, here's the planetary spheres, and here are the 9 levels of the spiritual hierarchies. Because there's not just angels and archangels, there's actually 9 levels in the classical teaching. Now there's a lot of hidden embedded information within the Rosicrucian tradition. And again, in the workshop we're doing in January, we're going to be focusing on the actual inner development practices from the Rosicrucian tradition. Mhm.
May I switch the tape? We just have one.
Let's see, where's Elizabeth? Okay, how are we doing on time? Should I go ahead and break here for the next?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and break here. And when we come back at the very end of the day, I've just got a few more slides. We'll wrap up after we do our work with Elizabeth and with Jane. And we'll finish out the last slides then. I'm going to ask Elizabeth when she comes back up for some of the titles, because Elizabeth's actually done the majority of research in this field. But there are very direct references to the goddess of the old Jewish tradition, to Asherah. And there's also the very strong aspect in the Jewish tradition of the feminine aspect of God, which is the Shekinah. The Shekinah being essentially the active force of God, which is somewhat related to the Shakti in the Indian tradition. So you find in the Indian tradition and in the Jewish tradition with Shakti and Shekinah that the actual active force of the Godhead is itself feminine. And so one thing we looked at this summer in the Vesica summer intensive was the Kabbalistic word, the Kabbalistic sound that connects Shekinah and Shakti and also Sekhmet in the old Egyptian tradition. Now these sounds of sh and ch are connected to this divine feminine force. And actually at that time, Elizabeth spoke a bit about some of the eurythmy aspects and some of the Kabbalistic word aspects of those sounds. And so the way that it's that divine feminine force that actually brings the force of God into active manifestation. That then also connects to the representation of the Sophia in medieval times. With the Sophia, the matrix itself, matrix being related to mater, mother, matrix is itself a feminine term because the matrix of creation is itself feminine, just as all life comes into the world through the feminine. So all of these ideas, I think, are linked together. Shekinah, Shakti, Sekhmet, and the Sophia with the matrix being essentially feminine for the place of birthing. Again, at the highest level, it is beyond gender differentiation. When it comes down into gender activities, in the ancient tradition, it was always the feminine that was the active aspect.
Could we put the microphone on, or would you prefer not?
No, we'll just leave it as it is for a moment. We're just going to go for a little
I
bit.
think it's recording off the camera. Shall
Okay.
we leave it on like that?
That's fine. Yes, please.
It's more ramblings and musings.
Okay.
You referred to blueprint patterns.
Yes.
You referred to packed thought forms. You have referred to energetic recognition of netters. Are there classic packed thought forms that are in fact blueprint patterns? And are netter energetic patterns, can we use the term there with blueprint patterns? How are they related? Are they related? Are they kind of first cousins? Or are they entirely different energy patterns?
They're all related. They all have to do with the particular blueprint of energy that gives rise to something. So for every human being, there's a set of blueprint energy patterns that makes up the totality of their being. The same thing is true for netters. They have a particular blueprint pattern for their particular construction as individual energy systems. Packed thought forms can contain any content. It might be the actual content of the blueprint for a living being, whether it's a spiritual being, human being, whatever it might be. Or it could be some other type of content. It could be something on an archetypal level that doesn't necessarily manifest as a specific being, but manifests somewhere else in creation. So packed thought forms are really that capacity that we have to download tremendous amounts of information in short periods of time that is a part of the classical system of energetic and information transmission from master to student in most traditions, where they really make a big deal of this idea of transmission and picking up the packed thought forms. This is also, again, related to developing particular centers in the energetic body, and particularly in the central column of energy, Classically, the first platform above the head and some of the higher platforms as well. So again, the basic thing is that everything is related to a blueprint of energy. A packed thought form can contain virtually anything, including blueprints of energy, but is not restricted to it. And again, the blueprints for the netters is the same as the blueprint for any other living energy system. It's a unique set of particular patterns, each of which is linked to particular qualities and particular functions. And so again, what we need to bear in mind is that everything that we do with our consciousness and our awareness, and also our subconscious, is actually developing energy patterns in our subtle bodies. And those energy patterns have a geometric basis to them when they manifest in space and in time. Also at the archetypal level, even before space and time, there is a blueprint pattern to it that will later manifest in space and time. But just as we talked about earlier, the circle at the archetypal level is not individualized into a specific size, color, etc. It is the pure archetype. And the same thing is true the higher we go up to the different spiritual levels. So that different traditions will talk about different spiritual planes, and they will in fact divide up the spiritual cosmos into different numerical systems. And one of the tricks of this is that how you divide a system for analysis will reveal or obscure particular aspects of that reality. So for instance, one of the things that we've given you a handout on, I'm not sure if it's in the weekend handouts or during the week, but one of the handouts is related to the way that in healing, there are different healing modalities that are based on dividing the system into different levels. And so in that particular document, I talk about if you're going to work with looking at the unity, the one, for healing, one of the best systems for explaining that is biogeometry, because it talks about the connection to center, and that the connection to center has those three aspects, the BG3, but essentially it is the energy quality that's before polarization. You're not bringing something one direction or the other, you're bringing it simply straight to center. And then if we move to polarized systems, there are all types of polarized systems. So polarity healing, per se, like the work of Randolph Stone, that's a polarity system. It's based on two polarities and balancing them so that if you're working with, let's say, color healing, and the energy is underactive, you'll apply a warming color to try to make it more active and bring it to center. If it's overactive, you'll apply a cooling color, blue, indigo, violet, and use that to bring it back to center. But it works with the polarity basis. Also, I Ching, Yin Yang, all these are polarity-based systems. All of manifest creation in the physical world as it moves from the Godhead to the manifestation of the world in front of us is based on polarity, which is why you have acid and base and chemicals, which is why you have positive and negative polarities and electricity and magnetism. It's all a polarity system. If you look at it from a polarity perspective, you'll see some phenomena and not see others. Then if you look at it from a threefold aspect, then you have Ayurveda and the three gunas in Ayurveda of tamas, sattva, rajas. There's particular qualities to these. Then if you go to the four, then you find systems using, let's say, the four elements and dividing up earth, air, fire, and water. And you go to the five, and then you have the five element systems like the Chinese system, etc. You can even go up to higher levels, like with the Enneagram, you divide it into 9 levels. According to how you divide the system, certain things will be revealed or they'll be obscured. And so this is part of the power of number. The number then has a type of cleaving or dissolving effect on the phenomena, and it will then break it up into particular discrete parts based on the power of the number. And so if you have a particular system in which the human being is revealed as a fourfold being, certain things are revealed by the fourfoldness. Other things are revealed by a sevenfold understanding of the human being, or a ninefold understanding. And the same thing for the spiritual planes. Depending on how you divide it up, certain things are revealed, certain things are obscured. So this is part of the way that we approach understanding blueprints by applying the analytical lens of the different powers of number. Because the blueprints themselves are matrices upon matrices, nets upon nets upon nets upon nets, which is why you go to different traditions around the world, and they have different pieces of valid knowledge of the whole, but sometimes they're completely different pieces. Classic one is that you train with somebody in Himalayas, and they only teach you for 40 years that you're there with them about chakras, and there's never one mention of acupuncture meridians or points. Or you can train with somebody in China, and there's never a mention of the chakra system, the way it's described in the Hindu tradition. It's all acupuncture meridians and points. All valid knowledge, and they're all different layers of the particular energy system. So just as different traditions have different ways of analyzing it, so one aspect of the power of number is applying it to the blueprints to begin to make it the different discrete parts. And so you can bring out the different functions that are innate within it. Yes, please.
Okay, when you're talking about the blueprint of energy manifests in space and time through geometry.
Yes.
Right? So if I look at the BG3 energy and I say there's an illness, and that to me means that there is an aberration in the geometry and the function of that system, whatever it could be. Okay, but the nervous system as an example, or the pineal gland, or whatever. So if you apply the BG3 energy to the pineal gland, that's where your focus is, as an example, or the nerve root that's going to the thumb, or whatever. You're directing the BG3 energy to that point. Is the quality of the BG3, the geometry of it, the perfect healing combination, like the 3, 7, and 12, like the 3 primary letters of the Hebrew, the division of the letters? Is that what we're talking about here? Is that related anyway? I'm trying to understand how the BG3 is healing energy if you're looking at it that the geometry determines the function in space and time, and if that's aberrated, how does the BG3 affect it?
It's a deep question, because what we come down to is that when we analyze particular aspects of geometry, we can see that particular geometries will give us particular energy qualities. The energy quality that comes from analyzing the center of the circle, or the center of any rotation, is BG3. Its energy quality and function is to bring something to the point of perfect balance. There's also the other layer of this, and when we did the biogeometry course, I mentioned that the more I work with the Egyptians, the more that one veil after another comes off. So one part of it is that this energy quality that's worked with in biogeometry is bringing things to center, to perfect balance. But the center is also a transcendental gateway beyond space and time. So what we get to in more advanced levels of biogeometry is that Dr. Karim will often emphasize that what we're actually doing is we're actually opening a door, and we're opening a door to spirit when we work with the BG3. And when you open that door, it's like an invitation for something to happen or something to come through. But it's also doing it in a way that is balanced, and is connected to center, is connected to the one. And because of that, there are deeper streams in the evolution of any energy system that, although it might appear in certain cases like we would like for something that's a problem to be resolved right now, in some cases, when you work with the BG3, you open that door. If there is something in what the Egyptians call the plane of divine wisdom that has something else in mind, that it could even be that an illness is actually meant to evolve alchemically to another stage. And in dealing with that illness, the person actually generates a force inside of themselves that alchemically will transmute a part of their energy body, or will transmute a part of their consciousness, or in time can lead to a particular evolution of the disease itself, because the disease is also an energy system. So there's many, many layers to this. This is why the Egyptians say that when you apply the BG3, it will never affect what they refer to as the divine plan. It will not change the divine plan. Sometimes there seems to be a miraculous healing. Other times there appears to be no effect, because it is bringing things both to balance, but also to that gateway, so that things will play out normally. Now this is different than if you do certain types of very strong interventions. So with some types of modern medicine, you can keep a person alive beyond their time of normal death by putting them in a machine that will make them breathe, or that will make their heart beat. The body itself would normally stop, but the machine's doing it for them. and they're being held in a state of suspended animation. They can no longer function, but their body can't die either. So the soul gets trapped in between. So with this working with the BG3, it has this aspect, again, opening the doorway and seeing what happens. So the Egyptians have kind of I'm going to connect it to the BG3, and then I'm going to let things take their course. But there's also the aspect with this that we described in the biogeometry course, that when you look at particular biogeometry tools, it's always a combination that they have the BG3 as a foundation. They all have BG3. But then they also have specific energy patterns that are to provide specific functions as well. And so depending on what the particular purpose of the device is, it'll have not only a BG3 field, but particular biosignatures or particular shapes that will provide specific sets of functions. And so that's another aspect of it, that from the biogeometry perspective, we always want to have the BG3 present. But we can then also bring in specialized energy functions that are needed, whether they're biosignatures or whether they're particular shapes, angles, etc. We can create any energy effect within the spectrum of possible energy by working with things like different proportions, or different angles, or different color qualities, or different sound qualities. And so we can really pick then, what is the specific energy quality I want to bring in addition to the BG3. But the Egyptians never do it without the BG3 as a foundation basis. And this then links us up to our background concept that when we test the energy quality of BG3, we find it not only in the center of the circle and other specific geometries, but it's also found innately in the healthy human immune system, in connection to beneficial spiritual beings, and in beneficial states of thought and emotion within the human being. So it's part of a larger complex, it's a larger matrix. So we have both the BG3 as a connection to center, and then we have specific energy functions of other patterns that can be brought in as well. I'll take one more, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Yes, please.
You spoke earlier today about squaring the circle in the context of looking at how the perimeters related to each other.
Yes.
The perimeter of the square and the circumference of the circle.
Yes.
But I was wondering, are there any traditions that look at how the circle and the square relate to each other as it relates to area, or cubing the sphere as it relates to volume?
Yes, absolutely. I'll let Jane go first on the area question.
Yes.
Do you have an example or a citation?
Actually, if we have time, we're going to do a drawing of commensurate squares. It's a big surprise.
So yes, there is work having to do with the actual area, and then also with volume in 3 dimensions with the cube and the sphere. And this is actually something we're getting to on Monday. I know you might not be here Monday, so what I would refer you to there is a book called Homage to Pythagoras. And there's an article in the book Homage to Pythagoras that's about the number 19 by Robert Lawler. And one thing that you find is that when you start looking at working with these volumes of the cube and the sphere, it relates to the quality of the number 19. So when Robert Lawler wrote this article, he's doing it from this Islamic perspective of the holy divine number 19. But from a biogeometry perspective, 19 also generates this BG3 energy at a pretty intense octave related to spiritual activities. But actually see the citation and the formula related to the volume. That would be the place to look. We've gone a little bit over time today, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We're going to start at 10 o'clock sharp tomorrow. And basically, we won't be ending any days before 5 o'clock, and we won't go past 6 o'clock. So every day we're going to end somewhere between 5 and 6. So that's going to be our ballpark. And when we come back tomorrow, in addition to taking the drafting and the rhythmic practices further, we're also going to do an energy exercise with me in the morning. And then we have a lot more to cover with our foundations. We're going to look at the question of sacred geometry with health, with the union of spirit and science as an energy science, and then with the masters of the compass and sacred design. So I'll see you here at 10 o'clock.